It is time now for the next installment of a massive archive show, specifically Radio Free America program number 37, How the United States Lost the Second World War. And when I talk about the U.S. losing the Second World War, I am in no way speaking figuratively. This is not a metaphor. Von Clausewitz, the famous Prussian military theoretician, noted, and this is an oft-quoted phrase, that war is the continuation of politics by other means. You will also see that translated, war is the continuation of policy by other means. In the nuclear age, it was simply not possible to defeat another nation by sending major army groups crashing across an opponent's border, because that would lead to mutually assured destruction. So what we are looking at in this program is politics, or policy, as the continuation of war by other means. This is a massive archive show. I'm doing it in installments, and I think it will go a long way toward explaining not only the history of the second half of the 20th century, but it will in particular explain how the United States has gotten to its present sorry state of affairs. I'm going to begin by reviewing some of the highlights of this archive show to date. We began by taking a look at the assassination of President Kennedy, one of the main base points, I should say, of the program that I've been doing for these many years, some 13 years now. And specifically, we took a look at George Bush, obviously the current president of the United States and the former director of the CIA, and we took a look at his relationship with George de Mohrenschildt, a former Nazi spy, a white Russian, an individual who went to work for the U.S. intelligence community in the post-World War II period, using his petroleum industry activities as a cover. And we took a look at de Mohrenschildt also, by the way, was one of Lee Harvey Oswald's babysitters. And we took a look at George Bush's place in an intelligence/petroleum industry milieu, which was front and center and deeply involved in the assassination of John Kennedy. It remains to be determined whether George Bush personally was involved in some way with the JFK assassination. His name crops up in connection with the investigation in a number of different ways, and it appears almost certain, in fact it is certain at this point, that as director of the CIA, he frustrated congressional attempts to look into the connections between the CIA and Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby. As I've said so often, the CIA did not kill President Kennedy, but there were CIA elements involved, and that necessitated a cover-up by the CIA proper. We began looking at this explicitly fascist milieu involving intersections and a cooperation between the intelligence community, the national security establishment, the American far right, and the petroleum industry in connection with the assassination of John Kennedy. After having examined this in the first two programs and how it operated in connection with the Kennedy assassination, we began to look at the historical development of this particular milieu. Now, from an historical/political standpoint, the John Kennedy assassination represented or was three very important things. First of all, it was the culmination of a constitutional struggle between the military and the executive branch. The military has never liked having a civilian commander-in-chief. We took a look at that in considerable detail in our Aryan Nation series, Radio Free America programs 10 through 13. And we also have looked at the John Kennedy assassination as the triumph of rollback or liberation theory of fighting the Cold War, as opposed to the containment theory of fighting the Cold War. And also, the assassination of President Kennedy represented, or was marked, I should say perhaps, the ascension of fascism in America. This evening, by the way, one of the central things that we're going to be focusing on is the generation of rollback or liberation theory vis-a-vis fighting the Cold War or waging the Cold War, and we're going to take a look specifically at the role of the Reinhard Gehlen Nazi Eastern Front spy outfit in generating that particular philosophy, and with the involvement of Gehlen and Gehlen-related elements in the U.S. national security establishment and political establishment, and how that led to the formation of rollback theory. One of the things that we began looking at in connection with the evolution of the milieu, this explicitly fascist milieu that we looked at in connection with John Kennedy's assassination, well, we began looking at the plans by the Third Reich to go underground during the course of the Second World War. The Nazis had determined early on that they were going to lose the Second World War, and they began making plans for resurgence, for post-war resurgence, and for the continuation of Nazism. One of the major things that we looked at in connection with the Nazis having gone underground, and one of the dominant operant considerations that we're looking at in this particular archive series, concerns the Third Reich's strategic use of anti-communism as a vehicle for conquest. Specifically, the German General Staff and the Nazi Party learned in the immediate post-World War I period that the fear of communism, both by their own industrialists and financiers and the population in general, and by the Western Allies, in this case the Allies of World War I, could be used to their own ends, specifically because of the German Revolution at the end of World War I. The Allies saw to it, and the Ebert government of the Weimar Republic saw to it, that the German General Staff and the German Army basically remained intact, and they then permitted it to proceed to quell the German Revolution. This provided for the survival of the German General Staff and the German military and the Nazi Party, which grew directly out of the German General Staff and the German military. Hitler, of course, was initially a Reichswehr intelligence agent, and the Nazi Party in its inception, as we looked at in Radio Free America program number 10, was, at least in the beginning, a front for Reichswehr intelligence. The Nazis' understanding of how anti-communism, the fear of communism, could be used as a vehicle for conquest is something that developed in the pre-World War II period and was utilized by the Nazis in the Second World War. It is one of the central operant and theoretical concepts in the analysis being presented in Radio Free America number 37. The Third Reich was able to achieve some of its astounding early military successes because many of the industrialists and financiers, as well as the general staffs allied with them, were more afraid of socialist movements in their own country than the domination by foreign fascists. Specifically, the French army was surrendered by Maréchal Pétain, the World War I hero and Vichy collaborator, so that it could be preserved, quote, to fight against communism. We took a look at the Third Reich's plans to go underground, specifically how the SS and Gestapo would constitute the core of the post-World War II Nazi underground, and another major strategic concept that the Third Reich, in planning to go underground, was formulating was a plan to hook up with sympathetic elements in other countries in order to preserve Nazism and to further their ends. Specifically, one of the major goals of the Third Reich in the World War II planning period for their post-World War II operations was to hook up with fascist sympathizers, both industrialists and financiers, and people farther down on the socioeconomic scale who were sympathetic to fascism, and specifically we took a look at how they planned to hook up with American industrialists and financiers of fascist sympathies in particular. We took a look, for example, in the book The Nazis Go Underground by Kurt Reese, at how, among others, the American tycoon William Grace might very well serve as a vehicle for the continuation of Nazism in the United States. William Grace was a good friend of the aforementioned George de Mohrenschildt. We also took a look at the targeting by the Third Reich of Harry Jung's American Vigilant Intelligence Federation, a fascist organization, an explicitly anti-Semitic organization that worked with the Hitler-Goebbels anti-Comintern in the 1930s and early 40s. The anti-Comintern was an international consortium of fascist organizations which was put together as an umbrella organization by the Third Reich. Jung's organization, Harry Jung's American Vigilant Intelligence Federation, was a major element in the United States of the anti-Comintern, and the files of Jung's organization served as the seed, so to speak, the seed for the files of an organization called the American Security Council. That organization deeply involved with an organization called the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, and that organization, as we have seen, which went on to become a key element of the World Anti-Communist League, was and is a major element of U.S. national security and covert operations, national security considerations and covert operations. The Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations and related elements, and the ABN is very close to the Galen organization. The ABN was one of the major elements that we looked at in connection with the assassination of President Kennedy. Now, by the way, if I'm going a little quickly here, or if this sounds a little glib, I apologize. Suffice it to say that Archives on Audio should be contacted to get the earlier installments of Radio Free America 37, because this is a massive program, and necessarily in recapping what we've looked at so far in many, many hours of broadcasting real time, I've got to present things rather quickly, and I can appreciate it if this seems a little sketchy or a little glib. Simply get a hold of the archives and peruse the information at length and in detail. Now, in the most recent installment of Radio Free America 37, the program that I did last week, we took a look at how German and American industrialists and financiers who were associated with the transatlantic financial and industrial axis that was instrumental in promoting fascism in Europe. We took a look at how people like Alan Dulles on the American side and people like Gero von Gebernitz on the German side, both of them working in an intelligence capacity for their respective governments, were negotiating during the course of the Second World War in order to form what they referred to as the Christian West concept. This basically was a plan on the part of the Third Reich and agreed to, a plan that was drawn up by elements of the Third Reich and agreed to by elements of Western intelligence, particularly Alan Dulles, head of the Bern, Switzerland OSS office, to shed Adolf Hitler and the more venal elements of Nazism, and to have the residua of the Third Reich and Germany in general hook up with the United States and Britain and France in an anti-communist, anti-Soviet coalition. The Christian West concept, again, was developed by elements of the Third Reich, agreed to by elements of our intelligence system associated with the transatlantic financial and industrial axis that I took a look at, or that we looked at in the first two Radio Free America shows, looking back from 1984, The Hidden History of the Cold War, Parts 1 and 2, and that we looked at in the Uncle Sam and the Swastika Archive show, the Uncle Sam and Il Duce Archive show, as well as Radio Free America number 10, and a miscellaneous archive show entitled Japanese Fascism, Its History and Significance for Contemporary Americans. And I encourage listeners not familiar with those programs to get a hold of them. Many of them I broadcast every Memorial Day weekend here on KFJC for those who are listening live. And for those of you who hear the program on tape, please get a hold of those archive shows, and it will flesh out your understanding of these particular events that I'm discussing. I would recommend very strongly, I do recommend, a current book called The Old Boys by Burton Hirsch, H-E-R-S-H. It goes into not only that transatlantic financial and industrial axis, but its very strong connections to U.S. intelligence and to the origins of the CIA, and the formation of the Christian West concept is discussed in detail in The Old Boys by Burton Hirsch. For my money, one of the very best books on the U.S. intelligence community and its origins. Now, as we looked at, the Christian West concept, basically a Third Reich concept, served as the seed concept for NATO. What we saw with NATO was a union, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What we saw with NATO was a union between the United States and Britain and France and other European nations with Germany in an anti-Soviet alliance. And as we've looked at in Radio Free America program number 2 and the various archive shows that I have done about the Galen organization, the Nazi Eastern Front spy outfit that we brought into the United States at the end of World War II, at the core of NATO was not only the Galen organization itself, an explicitly Nazi intelligence outfit, but beyond that, we took a look on how, in Radio Free America number 2, at how Nazism was never really removed from Germany. This is not to say that Germany, any given German is a Nazi, but the institutions of the Third Reich were never removed from what used to be known as the Federal Republic of Germany. The Third Reich's military people, many of them, its intelligence people in particular, many of the industrialists and financiers, and also many of the political figures from the Third Reich went on to dominate the operations of post-war Germany, initially the Federal Republic of Germany, and some of these same elements are in ascendance in the now United Germany. I would also refer listeners to a miscellaneous archive show that I recorded last March called The Old Germany and the New Nazis, which not only recaps a portion of Radio Free America number 2, but updates that to current goings-on with a very important paper by researcher Martin Lee. So again, one of the central features that was one of the features central to the Third Reich's plans to go underground was the Christian West concept, a formal divorce from Hitler and the most venal elements of Nazism in order to hook up with the so-called Western democracies, the U.S., Britain, and France, in an anti-Soviet alliance which would help to preserve not only German economic and military power, but also the political power of the Nazi Party. And this Christian West concept, and I realize this will seem controversial to many people, but the Christian West concept is basically what NATO was. The Christian West concept became NATO. It was the founding concept for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And Gero von Gewernitz, a Third Reich intelligencer and a member of this transatlantic financial and industrial axis, was instrumental in forming with Allen Dulles the Christian West concept, along with Prince Max von Hohenlohe, a representative of the SS and the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS intelligence service. Gero von Gewernitz was also deeply involved in prevailing on American General Edwin Siebert to take the Gehlen organization into the United States. Now again, the Reinhard Gehlen organization originally was known as Fremde Heere Ost, or Foreign Armies East, the FHO. It was the Third Reich's Eastern Front intelligence organization during World War II. It then jumped to the United States and became in turn the CIA's Department of Russian and Eastern European Affairs. It became the de facto NATO intelligence organization, and it was also installed as the BND, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the West German intelligence service, while continuing to function as the main intelligence organization on the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe for the CIA and for NATO. And as we've seen in numerous archive shows, the first 3 Radio Free America shows, Radio Free America numbers 11, 14, 15, 22, and 36, the Gehlen organization paved the way for the incorporation into the U.S. intelligence system of thousands of SS and Gestapo veterans, many of them war criminals of the First Order. Now, in the concluding element of last week's program, we looked at an article from Covert Action Information Bulletin number 3 by writer and researcher Carl Oglesby, and Oglesby advanced the concept that the Gehlen organization basically served as an arm of the Odessa, the post-World War II SS underground. Unfortunately, the Odessa is not merely a creature of fiction. It has been dealt with in espionage fiction. It was and is unfortunately a political reality, and Oglesby advances the theory that I also advanced in Radio Free America program number 3 in June of 1984, that the Gehlen organization basically served as a branch of the Odessa, operating not only in the United States but later in Germany, and beyond that, and most importantly, functioning at the very center of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which again grew out of the Christian West concept, a World War II Nazi concept, which provided for the survival of the Reich, minus some of the, at least ostensibly, minus some of the more venal elements of Nazism, and that survived Reich was to function in conjunction with, again, the Western Allies, U.S., Britain, France, etc., in an anti-Soviet alliance. One of the most important points that Oglesby makes is that as the Gehlen organization was being incorporated into the U.S. intelligence system, Reinhard Gehlen was still seeking approval from his military and political superiors, notably Admiral von Dönitz, Karl von Dönitz, who succeeded Adolf Hitler, and also General Franz Halder, Halder, who was his immediate Wehrmacht superior. I also noted that the Gehlen organization worked very, very closely with the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, the main organization of the SS, and in particular it was very close, that the Gehlen organization was very close to the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS intelligence service, and Amt 6, the foreign affairs branch of the Sicherheitsdienst, headed up by Walter Schellenberg. Now, Carl Oglesby advances the hypothesis, and this is something I have also spoken of, that the Gehlen organization literally served as a Trojan horse in the United States. Although it was brought into the country ostensibly to serve the United States, in fact, it turned out to be an extremely destructive thing for the United States. We're going to be taking a look at just how destructive it was. And again, I think the Trojan horse metaphor that was advanced by Carl Oglesby in Covert Action Information Bulletin number 33 is a very, very accurate one. Recall that one of the points that Oglesby cites is that part of the agreement that was reached between Reinhard Gehlen and his ostensible masters in the United States was that when there was a conflict between German interests and American interests as far as the Gehlen organization went, that the Gehlen organization would be understood to act on behalf of German interests, and that's exactly what it did. What we're going to be looking at this evening is how the Gehlen organization functioned as a Trojan horse, and how the Gehlen organization began to function as a vehicle for literally defeating the United States. Not defeating it on the battlefield, not defeating it militarily, but defeating it economically and politically by affecting the American military strategic perceptions, and also, and in connection with that, affecting American political life as well. What we're going to be taking a look at this evening is just how the Gehlen organization affected American strategic perceptions, and in connection with that, how American strategic perceptions and the Gehlen organization affected American political life. What we're going to begin looking at this evening is another work, or a short section of another work by Carl Oglesby. We're going to be reading now a short section from a book called The Yankee and Cowboy War, subtitled Conspiracies from Dallas to Watergate and Beyond. That is authored by Carl Oglesby, O-G-L-E-S-B-Y. It was published in softcover by Berkeley Medallion Books and was copyrighted 1976. Of the effect of the Gehlen organization on the United States, Carl Oglesby writes as follows in The Yankee and Cowboy War. Look what power the victors conceded the vanquished. Exclusive purveyor of intelligence on the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe to the United States, West Germany, and NATO, Gehlen and the spirit kept alive in him and his staff had more power over official American perceptions in the post-war world than even a German victory could have given them. The Gehlen-Vlasov intelligence system had become a main source and fountain of official American consciousness. Indeed, Oglesby's statement is very, very accurate. What we're going to look at this evening is how the Gehlen organization affected the American political consciousness. And I would note, too, that I think Oglesby's statement is very accurate, that the spirit kept alive in Gehlen and his staff had more power over official American perceptions than even a Nazi victory could have given them. Even, suppose for the sake of argument, that the Third Reich had conquered the United States militarily during the Second World War, and we were an occupied country, the official pronouncements of the German occupation government would have been greeted by the vast majority of Americans with extreme skepticism. They would have said basically, oh, well, that's just the Gestapo talking, that's Herr Goebbels talking, we can't believe a word of that. But when the perceptions of the Gehlen organization, both military and political, as we will see this evening, were presented under the rubric of the old red, white, and blue, they gained a credibility in the eyes of the American military planners and in the eyes of American politicians, and most importantly, in the eyes of the American public, that they could never have had the Third Reich conquered the United States militarily. Again, the American people would have greeted the pronouncements of a German occupation government with a great deal of skepticism. However, when the same pronouncements and the same perceptions were presented to the American people and their political and military leaders under the auspices of the red, white, and blue, they gained a credibility and an influence and a power that they could never have had otherwise. And what we're going to look at this evening is how that influence by the Galen Organization was wielded. We will come back to the assassination of President Kennedy in weeks to come and take a look at the ultimate culmination of the generation of political consciousness in the United States by the Galen Organization that resulted in November of '63 in the assassination of John Kennedy, and ultimately the liberation or rollback theory, the Galen genesis of which we will be looking at this evening, had its culmination in the Reagan and Bush years, and we will be taking a look at the Reagan and Bush administration as the ultimate fulfillment of rollback or liberation theory vis-a-vis fighting the Cold War. And we will take a look also, we will review very briefly in weeks to come some of the major points of Radio Free America program number 36, the destabilization of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. We're going to begin by taking a look at one of the main ways that the Galen Organization influenced American strategic thinking and how it was able to influence the course of the Cold War, and that is by provoking the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union became aware of the negotiations between the alliance, I should say, between the Galen Organization and the United States early on. That in and of itself helped to exacerbate tensions between the United States and Soviet Union and helped to preclude what possibility there might have been of a satisfactory diplomatic and political resolution to the conflicts and the disagreements between the USSR and the United States. Now, as Oglesby has pointed out, this is not to say in any way that there would not have been a Cold War without the Galen Organization. There almost certainly would have been, but the degree of tension between the U.S. and the former USSR and the effects of the Cold War on American political life and on the world political structure would have been vastly different had the Galen Organization not been brought into the United States, where, again, it served as a wing of the Odessa, and it served as a Trojan horse inside of the United States. In addition to examining how the Galen Organization helped to exacerbate tensions between the U.S. and USSR by provoking the Soviet Union, we're going to take a look at the grossly exaggerated reports that were given by the Galen Organization to the U.S. national security establishment concerning not only Soviet intentions but Soviet military capabilities as well. Basically, the Galen Organization, I should say, fed the United States a lot of very serious BS about both what the Soviets were up to and what they were capable of doing militarily, and this did much to fan the flames of the Cold War, to mix a metaphor. It did a great deal to exacerbate tensions between the U.S. and the USSR, which ultimately led to the very destructive arms race which bankrupted the Soviet Union and led to its dissolution in considerable measure. It also in considerable measure led to the bankrupting of the United States, and it's one of the main reasons why we are in the current situation that we are in. After taking a look at the Galen Organization and how it provoked the Soviet Union and how it misled the United States about Soviet capabilities and intentions, we're going to take a look at how the Galen Organization and related Third Reich elements were able to fundamentally alter American political thinking in the Cold War period, in the McCarthy period in particular. We're going to take a look at how U.S. intelligence, the CIA in particular, introduced many of the Soviet and Eastern European fascist émigrés, who comprised a very important element of the Galen Organization, how they were introduced into the United States during the Cold War period as a result of illegal operations inside of the United States by elements of the CIA, in particular the CFF, the Crusade for Freedom, and how these Galen and Galen-related elements were to lead to the generation of liberation or rollback theory of fighting the Cold War. Originally, liberation theory began as a Third Reich political and psychological warfare tactic and as a major pillar of Third Reich covert operations. We're going to see how that evolved not only into a major pillar of American and CIA political warfare, but how it became a major force in American political thinking, ultimately having a profound effect on the development of the Republican Party, among other American political interests. And we are also, later on, we will touch back on something that we've already touched on, namely how many of the tactics that were inherent in the liberation or rollback theory as practiced by the Third Reich eventually came to be used by the U.S. national security establishment, by our intelligence services, and one tactic in particular, espoused by the NTS or Solidarists, the tactic of provoking a mutiny by the Red Army, ultimately saw its fulfillment in the August 1991 coup, which was unsuccessful and which provoked a mutiny by the Red Army, which led to not only the outlawing of the Soviet Communist Party, but which led to the dissolution, the physical dissolution of the Soviet Union itself. But the main focus this evening will be on how the Gehlen Organization affected American strategic and political thinking. For the duration of the broadcast this evening, we're going to take a look at what is almost certainly the single most important book about not only the Gehlen Organization, but about the importation of residual Third Reich elements into the U.S. national security establishment. That book is entitled Blowback, subtitled America's Recruitment of Nazis and Its Effects on the Cold War, and that was authored by Christopher Simpson, S-I-M-P-S-O-N. It was published in hardcover by Weidenfeld and Nicholson and copyrighted 1988. Weidenfeld, by the way, is W-E-I-D-E-N-F-E-L-D, and they're located in New York. What we're going to begin looking at is the interaction between the Office of Strategic Services, World War II's intelligence, American Intelligence Service, or the American Intelligence Service in World War II, and the Gehlen Organization. In Carl Oglesby's essay, which I read last week, he does not discuss the contacts between the OSS and the Gehlen Organization. They were eclipsed or ignored in Oglesby's work, but it is important to understand that the OSS and many of the key officials in the OSS who went on to become major players in the CIA were in fact deeply involved with the generation of the Gehlen Organization and its incorporation into the United States. Simpson writes of this in Blowback as follows. General William Wild Bill Donovan and Alan Dulles of America's Wartime Clandestine Operations Agency, the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, were also tipped off about Gehlen's offer by a Dulles double agent inside the German Foreign Office. The OSS was soon jockeying with U.S. military intelligence for institutional authority over Gehlen's microfilmed records, and before long, over control of the German spy master himself. And in a footnote to that passage, he goes on to add, Frank Wisner's Special Intelligence Branch staff, which was engaged in work with Gehlen, had more than its share of brilliant operatives who were to leave their marks on the history of U.S. espionage. They included Richard Helms, for example, later to become CIA Deputy Director for Clandestine Operations, and eventually Agency Director under Presidents Johnson and Nixon. William Casey, CIA Director under President Reagan, Harry Rositzke, R-O-S-I-T-Z-K-E, soon to become Chief of CIA Clandestine Operations inside the USSR, and later CIA Chief of Station in India, and of course Wisner himself, soon to be Chief of all American clandestine warfare operations worldwide. Of course, it was Wisner who brought in, among others, Stefan Bandera and his OUNB organizations, the connections between that organization, the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, and among other things, the assassination of John Kennedy is something that we looked at in the second installment of this particular archive show. And again, I go into the Wisner Special Intelligence Branch of the OSS and its connections to Gehlen, because again, William Casey be a major player in the resolution of the historical conflicts that we're looking at in Radio Free America 37. William Casey was a major player under the Reagan administration. Now, of the manner in which the incorporation of the Gehlen Organization helped to exacerbate the tensions already existing between the Soviet Union and the United States, Simpson writes as follows. The documentation that might establish exactly how much President Truman knew about American recruitment of Galen and his organization remains classified. It is known, however, that the Soviets made vigorous protests against this secret agreement at least as early as the Potsdam Conference. Thus, it is unlikely that the matter escaped Truman's attention altogether. Considering the senior status of Donovan, Dulles, Siebert, and the other U.S. intelligence officers known to have been directly involved, and considering that two competing American intelligence bureaucracies were attempting to share Galen's archives, it is reasonable to suspect that the President had been well briefed about this operation. Now, more in blowback about the effects of the Galen organization in exacerbating U.S.-USSR tensions, and it should be noted that as early as the Potsdam Conference, the Soviet Union was already protesting to the United States about the Galen organization. More from Christopher Simpson's Blowback. Contrary to the accepted wisdom, however, U.S. dependence on Galen's organization for intelligence on the Soviet military was quite likely a blunder from a strictly practical point of view. For one thing, enlisting Galen was in itself a substantial escalation of the Cold War that undermined what little hope was possible for East-West cooperation during the pivotal years of 1945 to 1948. And again, I will reiterate what Oglesby said in the essay in Covert Action Information Bulletin. This should not be interpreted as meaning that the United States that there would not have been a Cold War had the U.S. not incorporated Galen. There would have been, but the effect of the Galen organization on the degree of alienation between the USSR and the United States, and ultimately the effects of the Galen organization on the history of the world in the second half of the 20th century, well, those effects were dramatic, and the Cold War would have had a very, very different effect on world history had it not been for the Galen organization. Now, what we're going to look at next, aside from the role of the Galen organization in provoking the Soviets, and obviously they were aware as early as the 1945 Potsdam Conference about the Galen-U.S. agreement, one of the most important ways that the Galen organization affected the development of American political life was by feeding grossly exaggerated, grossly inaccurate intelligence to the United States about just what the Galen organization was, or what the Soviet Union, I should say, was up to, what it was planning to do politically, and what it was capable of doing both politically and militarily. Simpson writes about this in a chapter appropriately entitled The Eyes and Ears. Of all the networks of former Nazis and collaborators employed by the United States after World War II, it is Galen's organization that has left the most substantial imprint on the United States. Galen's analysis of the forces that guide Soviet behavior, which were forged in part by his personal defeat at the hands of the Russians during World War II, became widely accepted in U.S. intelligence circles and remains so to this day. Galen's singular error, says Arthur Macy Cox, C.O.X., a career Soviet affairs analyst who has served with both the CIA and the Department of State, is that he presented the political threat posed by the USSR as though it were an imminent military problem, thus, quote, ingratiating himself, unquote, as Cox puts it, again quoting, with the unreconstructed Cold Warriors in the Pentagon and on Capitol Hill. Galen's influential intelligence and analysis also strongly reinforced the, quote, communist conspiracy, unquote, model of foreign affairs, in which the hand of the Kremlin could be seen in almost every labor dispute and student strike on the continent. Now, one of the points that I want to underscore very heavily this evening is that the Galen organization's effect on the United States should in no way be seen outside of the context of other major American factors in American politics and American society, which provided the vehicle for the Galen organization to influence American society in the way that it did. The Galen organization and the analysis that I'm presenting this evening should never be seen as existing in a political vacuum. Rather, and this is one of the most important points in this installment of Radio Free America 37, rather, the profound effect of the Galen organization on the United States and the effect the Galen organization has had on world history could only have been accomplished as a result of its interaction with very powerful elements in the American political makeup, namely some of the elements cited here, the, quote, unreconstructed Cold Warriors, unquote, in the Pentagon and in Capitol Hill, the defense industry in particular, what President Eisenhower referred to as the military-industrial complex, was a major element which permitted the Gehlen Organization to have the effect that it had. And obviously the industrialists and financiers in this country, both those of conservative bent who were afraid of communism and also those of explicitly fascist orientation, the ones that we looked at in Uncle Sam and the Swastika and other broadcasts, they were already very receptive not only to the exaggerated picture of the Soviet Union that Gehlen presented, but also to the explicitly fascist nature of the Gehlen Organization, and ultimately that fascist nature came to be expressed directly in American political life, as we will see. What we're going to look at now is how the Gehlen Organization provided grossly inaccurate intelligence to the United States. Now, a word briefly about the Soviet occupation of much of Eastern Europe. One of the factors that is largely ignored or overlooked by American political analysts is the fact that in addition to Japan, Germany, and Italy, the main Axis nations of World War II, the Axis was also comprised of Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria, three of the nations occupied by the Soviet Union, which became the Warsaw Pact nations. Another major element of the Warsaw Pact, obviously, was East Germany, which, of course, was part of the original German Reich. It should also be noted that Czechoslovakia, under Nazi occupation, was divided up, and Slovakia became an independent fascist state under the Third Reich, and now it has achieved its independence again in the post-Cold War period. We'll discuss that fleetingly during the course of the program, during the course of Radio Free America 37 in later installments. It should be noted that from the Soviet point of view, much of what they were doing in Eastern Europe was occupying and altering the political structure of fascist nations, nations which had participated in the enormously destructive invasion of the Soviet Union. Again, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, East Germany, and Slovakia, part of Czechoslovakia, were all part of the Axis in World War II. It should also be noted that Poland, although it was not part of the Axis, was a fascist country prior to World War II. Poland for many years was dominated by the brutal dictator Pilsudski, and Pilsudski, although a strong Polish nationalist, was basically a fascist and described as such by, among others, George Seldes, regarded by many as the dean of American investigative reporters. Because, however, Poland was nationalistic and because it lay between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, it ultimately became the first victim of Nazi conquest and suffered brutally under the occupation of the Third Reich. One of the things that we looked at in Radio Free America program number 14, and that we reprised to a considerable extent in Radio Free America program number 36, was the Promethean League, or the Prometheus Organization. That was sort of a pre-Wackle-Wackle. It was an anti-communist coalition which was based in Poland and which operated to a large extent as a result of Polish support. It was also financed heavily by France. But the Promethean League, an explicitly anti-Soviet organization, not only functioned in Poland under Pilsudski and then Pilsudski's successor, whose name I've forgotten, but he was basically a Pilsudski puppet, but later the Promethean League was incorporated into the Third Reich after its successful invasion of Poland and worked against the Soviet Union during World War II. We're going to look at now, again, a discussion of how the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe and the Soviet intentions and military capabilities were fundamentally exaggerated by Gehlen, and how this exaggeration came to affect the American strategic thinking and ultimately American political life as well. We're going to look at now, again, a discussion of how the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe and the Soviet intentions and military capabilities were fundamentally exaggerated by Gehlen, and how this exaggeration came to affect the American strategic thinking and ultimately American political life as well. I was going to say Oglesby, Simpson writes in Blowback, Most important, Galen's operatives and analysts strongly reinforced U.S. intelligence's existing predilection toward paranoia about communism and the USSR, contributing significantly to the creation of a body of widely believed misinformation about Soviet behavior. Quote, Galen had to make his money by creating a threat that we were afraid of, unquote, says Victor Marchetti, formerly the CIA's chief analyst of Soviet strategic war plans and capabilities, quote, again quoting, so we would give him more money to tell us about it, unquote. He continues, again quoting, in my opinion, the Galen organization provided nothing worthwhile for understanding or estimating Soviet military or political capabilities in Eastern Europe or anywhere else, unquote. And again, this is from Marchetti, formerly the CIA's chief analyst of Soviet strategic war plans and capabilities, repeating that last sentence again because it's an accurate gauge of what Galen was doing. In my opinion, the Galen organization provided nothing worthwhile for understanding or estimating Soviet military or political capabilities in Eastern Europe or anywhere else, unquote. Employing Galen was, again quoting, a waste of time, money, and effort, unquote. I would also note that Marchetti goes on to describe how the Galen organization was heavily penetrated by Soviet intelligence. This has been widely reported. We touched on that in Radio Free America number 3. Galen's chief of counterintelligence for many years was a former SS man named Heinz Felfa, who turned out to be in the employ of the Soviet Union. One of the things that I generally avoid in this broadcast is what might be termed spy versus spy, because the waters of double and triple agents and the penetration of intelligence services by their rivals is something that is very difficult to get to the bottom of, although it is a matter of public record that there was widespread penetration of Galen's organization by Soviet intelligence. One of the things that has never been dealt with substantively is the extent to which some of these penetrations might have actually been used as triple operations by the Galen organization. Certainly, the Galen organization had an effect on Soviet intelligence. Undoubtedly, some of the infiltrators, some of the Soviet infiltration of the Galen organization permitted the Soviets to view Galen and his activities in an accurate way. That would have contributed to the alienation on the part of the Soviets, who would have had a first-hand picture of the extent to which the United States and the other NATO countries were incorporating elements of the Third Reich and collaborating with many of the most heinous elements of Nazism. But one of the things that we will never know for sure, because it's a cinch that neither the BND nor the CIA, and in all probability neither the KGB, will ever tell us, is the extent to which some of those infiltrators might have been known to Galen and how the Galen organization might have employed some of them as triple agents. The Soviets may have thought that they were in fact working for them while ostensibly working for Galen, while they may in fact, some of them anyway, may very well have been working as triple agents, and the effect of those triple agents, and I'm sure it's a safe bet that there were some. How many we'll never know, but it's a safe bet that some of them at least were functioning as triple agents, and it may have been in an excellent position to not only in turn infiltrate Soviet intelligence, but to feed them disinformation as well. Continuing with how the Galen organization was able to feed the United States grossly inaccurate information concerning the Soviet Union, what we're going to look at next concerns how the Soviet forces in Eastern Europe were essentially war-weary occupation troops, and how Soviet logistical capabilities from a military standpoint were dependent on rail and horseback, because Soviet forces were not motorized to anywhere near the extent that Western armies were. Any large-scale offensive by the Soviet military would have been dependent on the use of rail, and as we're about to see, rather than shoring up the rail system in Germany and elsewhere in Eastern Europe, they were tearing up thousands of miles of tracks and bringing them back to the Soviet Union to help repair the enormous damage that they suffered during the course of World War II. Another major factor that is discussed in the passage we're about to read concerns the fact that as late as 1950, half of the Soviets' transport for their army was horse-drawn. Now, as Simpson notes here, in the frozen stretches of the Soviet North, that can be a tremendous advantage because Russian ponies can keep going long after motorized vehicles would have seized up with the extreme cold. But in Western Europe, that would have been a very, very different story indeed. What we're going to look at is how U.S. military analysts initially observed these tremendous weaknesses in the Soviet logistical capability and observed the fact that the vast majority of Soviet forces in Eastern Europe and Germany were war-weary occupation forces and not the highly mobilized armored forces of aggression that Galen represented them as being. And as we shall see, the effects of the Galen Organization were to fundamentally pervert and then erase the accurate American intelligence perceptions of the Soviet Union, both their intentions and capabilities in the immediate post-World War II period. Also note that while Galen was convincing the United States that the Soviets were about to attack, the United States was the only country which had the atomic bomb. The Soviets had no navy to speak of. They had no long-range bomber force. The U.S., on the other hand, did have a very powerful air force, including long-range bombers, and they had the atomic bomb, which would have been decisive in any kind of conflict, even had that not been the case, because, as I said, of the Soviet dependence on rail and horseback, there was absolutely no way that the Soviet Union was about to attack the United States. Returning to Blowback by Christopher Simpson, the Galen Organization was the one group that did have the networks inside Eastern Europe, and that is why we hired them, unquote. International Affairs expert Arthur Macy Cox says, again quoting, "But hiring Galen was the biggest mistake the U.S. ever made. Our allies said, you are putting Nazis at the senior levels of your intelligence, unquote, and they were right. It discredited the United States," unquote. According to Cox, the Galen Organization was the primary source of intelligence that claimed that, quote, the Soviets were about to attack West Germany. That was the biggest bunch of baloney then, and it is still a bunch of baloney today. Note that Cox worked both for the State Department and the CIA. Continuing. The crucial period of 1945 to 1948, when East-West relations moved from a wary peace to an intense political war, provides one case study of the damage that Galen's intelligence and analysis could produce. Among the most basic elements in the American interpretation of European events during the early Cold War years was the evaluation of the Red Army. That subject, it will be recalled, was Galen's specialty. In mid-1946, U.S. military intelligence correctly reported that the Red Army, then in control of most of Eastern Europe, was under-equipped, overextended, and war-weary. Its estimate of the number of Soviet troops in Eastern and Central Europe was quite high, some 208 divisions, but the U.S. Army concluded that these forces were almost entirely tied down with administrative, police, and reconstruction tasks in the Russian-occupied zone. Soviet military aggression against Western Europe was highly unlikely for at least a decade, if only for logistical reasons the Army determined. Particularly intriguing were 1946 U.S. Army reports concerning railroads in eastern Germany. The Red Army, it was well known, lacked the motorized strength of Western forces and relied heavily on the railroads to move troops to the front and for logistic support. The U.S. Army intelligence reports drawn from military attachés inside the Soviet zone, from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey research teams in Eastern Europe, and from other on-the-spot reports prior to the Soviet decision to close its occupation zone to the west, made it clear that the Russians were tearing up much of the German railroad network and shipping it back to the USSR as war reparations. The Soviets uprooted about a third of the entire German railway system, including such strategic lines as the Berlin-Leipzig and Berlin-Frankfurt, seizing train yards, switches, and thousands of miles of track. Whatever else may be said of this form of Russian industrial development, it was clearly not the behavior of a military power contemplating a blitzkrieg attack. Over the next 2 years, however, the U.S. appraisal of the capabilities and intentions of the Red Army fundamentally shifted, and this change was pushed along by misleading reports and mistaken warnings from the Galen Organization. By the time the reappraisal was over, it had become an article of faith in Washington, D.C. that the war-weary Soviet occupation forces were actually fresh assault troops poised for an attack on the West. In a footnote to the passage about the tearing up the cannibalizing by the Soviets of the German railway system, Simpson goes on to add, as late as 1950, fully half of the Soviets' transport for their standing army was horse-drawn. This actually had some advantages in the trackless frozen north, where Russian ponies were useful long after tanks and trucks had frozen up or bogged down in snowdrifts. Western Europe, however, was quite a different place. Now, returning to the fundamental misinformation given the United States about the Soviets by the Galen Organization, repeating again the last sentence that I read in that context, by the time the reappraisal by Galen was over, it had become an article of faith in Washington, D.C., that the war-weary Soviet occupation forces were actually fresh assault troops poised for an attack on the West. The Americans' new estimate of the number of those troops, furthermore, was also greatly exaggerated because it did not take into account the large-scale demobilization of Soviet forces after 1945. As U.S. intelligence's primary source of information on the Soviet military during this pivotal period of the Cold War, Galen's organization played an important role in the creation of the American evaluation, or rather misevaluation, of Soviet power in Europe that has not been adequately appreciated until recently. And again, note that, as Simpson says here, repeating another sentence, the Americans' new estimate of the number of those troops, furthermore, was also greatly exaggerated because it did not take into account the large-scale demobilization of Soviet forces after 1945. To this day, and you can see this on documentaries or hear it on radio documentaries, it remains an article of faith of Cold War history that the U.S. demobilized at the end of World War II and the Soviets didn't. That is simply not the case, and that misinformation was handed to the United States by the Galen Organization. Very, very, very important piece of misinformation, one which survives to this day. So again, the Galen Organization provided us with misinformation about what Soviet capabilities were, even though they were largely dependent on horses as late as 1950 for their logistical support system, and even though they were cannibalizing the German rail system, thereby precluding the possibility of a blitzkrieg attack of the type foreseen by Galen. Because of our dependence on Galen, a fundamentally distorted picture of the Soviet Union was presented in the United States. And again, bear in mind one of the major strategic concepts that the Third Reich had learned, and we're seeing this major strategic concept being put into effect inside the United States, or upon the United States. Namely, again, the Third Reich's understanding that anti-communism, the fear of communism by the Western industrial nations, could be used as a vehicle for furthering their own interests, including the conquest of those nations. Military conquest during World War II, as we've touched on, and political conquest in the post-World War II period. Now, what we're going to look at next is one of the major contexts in which the Galen misevaluation of Soviet military capabilities and intentions was put into effect. The so-called Czech crisis of 1948, in which the Soviets came to occupy Czechoslovakia, served as a major alarm bell to the United States. That alarm bell was sounded by Galen, and we're going to take a look at just how exaggerated the U.S. estimates of Soviet capabilities and intentions were as a result of Galen. And one of the things that's most important about the passages that we're about to read is to understand the role of the so-called military-industrial complex, as President Eisenhower referred to it, namely not only the Pentagon per se, but also the very powerful and lucrative defense industries, because one of the major ways that the Galen Organization was able to affect American political life as well as military life and military conceptions was by creating an exaggerated threat of the Soviet Union, which served the interests of the defense industries as well as the Pentagon. More money was made all the way around. It also, the exaggerated views given by Galen, the exaggerated estimates, the misinformation, also served to reinforce the interests of what Arthur Macy Cox referred to as the unreconstructed Cold Warriors in both the Pentagon and in Capitol Hill. And again, I want to underscore a central point in this archive show, and in particular in this installment of the archive show, the effect of the Gehlen Organization and related elements on the United States, and I'm talking here about the paperclip rocket scientists as well as some of the other Nazi and fascist collaborators that were brought in other programs, not specifically as a result of the Gehlen Organization, that their effect on the United States was precisely as a result of the way in which they interacted with other major American political and military forces. The Gehlen Organ-related elements did not operate in a vacuum, but the pivotal effect they had was precisely as a result of their interaction, both direct and indirect, with other major American political forces. One should never lose sight of that major point during the course of this installment of the program, of this archive show, I should say. Continuing now with Simpson's analysis, we're going to take a look at how Gehlen fundamentally misrepresented Soviet capabilities during the Czech crisis of 1948. Simpson writes, by late 1947, however, Gehlen had become, quote, an alarm signal, unquote, as Höhne of Der Spiegel puts it, in a series of secret conferences with General Lucius Clay, then the U.S. commander in Germany. He reported to Clay that there were no fewer than 175 Red Army divisions in Eastern Europe, that most of them were combat-ready, and that quiet changes already underway in Soviet billeting and leave policies for these troops suggested a major mobilization could be in the wind. The Soviets' behavior should be interpreted as a prelude to military aggression, he argued. Then, in February of 1948, two important events took place. The coalition government that had governed Czechoslovakia since the end of the war collapsed, in part because the United States declined fully to support Czech President Edvard Beneš, a social democrat, on the ground that he was insufficiently anti-communist. That man's name, Edvard Benes. Continuing. The Czech Communist Party took power with Red Army backing, thus strongly reinforcing Western apprehensions about the possibility of an eventual Soviet military attack on Western Europe. Within days of the Czech events, the U.S. Army within days of the Czech events, the U.S. Army General Staff Chief of Intelligence, General Stephen J. Chamberlain, Chamberlin, who had earlier been instrumental in the scientists' affair, met with General Clay in Germany. Very important sentence follows. In these encounters, Chamberlain stressed, quote, the fact that major military appropriations bills were pending before congressional committees, unquote, as Gene Edward Smith, editor of Clay's papers, has noted, and again quoting, and the need to galvanize American public opinion to support increased defense expenditures, unquote. The public in the United States was unwilling to finance the military adequately, Chamberlain argued, unless it was thoroughly alarmed about an actual military attack from the USSR. So here again, we're taking a look at how the Gehlen Organization, interacting with powerful American political forces and military forces, was able to have the effect that it did. Last few sentences again. Within days of the Czech events, the U.S. Army General Staff Chief of Intelligence, General Stephen J. Chamberlain, who had earlier been instrumental in the scientists' affair, met with General Clay in Germany. In these encounters, Chamberlain stressed, quote, the fact that major military appropriations bills were pending before congressional committees, unquote, as Gene Edward Smith, the editor of Clay's papers, has noted, and the need to galvanize American public opinion to support increased defense expenditures. The public in the United States was unwilling to finance the military adequately, Chamberlain argued, unless it was thoroughly alarmed about an actual military attack from the USSR. Acting in response to Chamberlain's requests, Clay issued sharply worded telegrams that strongly implied a full-scale Soviet military offensive against Western Europe was brewing. Again quoting, for many months, based on logical analysis, I have felt and held that war with the Soviets was unlikely for at least 10 years, unquote, Clay cabled to Washington on March 5, 1948. Again quoting, within the last few weeks, however, I have felt a subtle change in the Soviet attitude, which now gives me a feeling that it may come with dramatic suddenness, unquote. Gehlen's studies of the Red Army provided the intelligence according to the Office of National Estimates, or ONE, according to the Office of National Estimates, ONE source, they were the, quote, facts, unquote, that supported his argument. Clay's officially top-secret telegram was quickly leaked to the U.S. press and was whipped up by the media into a full-blown war scare that is generally recognized today as one of the most important watersheds of the Cold War. I'll get the last couple of sentences again. Galen's studies of the Red Army provided the intelligence underpinning for Clay's comments. According to the Office of National Estimates, or ONE source, they were the, quote, facts, unquote, that supported his argument. Clay's officially top-secret telegram was quickly leaked to the U.S. press and was whipped up by the media into a full-blown war scare that is generally recognized today as one of the most important watersheds of the Cold War. Policymakers in Washington accepted the contention that 175 fully armed Red Army divisions stood poised in the Soviet-occupied zone, waiting restlessly to attack. Galen's central contention that the USSR had not substantially demobilized its troops since the war, while the United States had, was accepted without question at the time and widely regarded as proof of an aggressive Soviet intent toward Western Europe. And again, that myth of no Soviet demobilization survives to this day. Continuing. Equally revealing, the same troops that the 1946 U.S. Army analysis had described as being tied down with, quote, immediate occupation and security requirements, unquote, were now described in Galen's estimates and later in the intelligence summaries of the Pentagon as well as, quote, a highly mobile and armored spearhead for an offensive in Western Europe, unquote, according to a crucial Joint Chiefs of Staff War Plan summary. The U.S. Army's earlier acknowledgment of the transport and logistic problems faced by the Red Army disappeared from the top-secret appraisals of Soviet capabilities. Instead, the Russians were said now to be able to launch large-scale offensives in Europe, the Middle East, and the Far East, all at the same time. And what I'm going to read now is a footnote that Simpson provides, and this is the U.S. War Contingency Plans of 1949. What's significant here is to note that not only is this estimate of Soviet capabilities ridiculous in terms of 1949, again, the Soviets had no Navy to speak of, they had no long-range bomber force, and they just tested their atomic bomb in 1949. The U.S. had a powerful Navy, a long-range bomber force, and had the bomb in production, but at the height of Soviet military capabilities, even had nuclear weapons never been invented, the Soviets, at the height of their military power in, say, the 1960s or 70s or early 80s, never had anything even remotely close to the capabilities that they were being described as having in 1949. Perhaps those listeners with backgrounds in the military and/or intelligence community will realize the complete ridiculousness of this following analysis. Again, this is 1949. They never had the capability to do what they were supposed to have been able to do in 1949. And again, this shows the effect of the Galen misestimates. The U.S. War Contingency Plans of 1949 are a vivid illustration of the degree of self-deception that had taken hold among U.S. intelligence analysts at the time, in part as a result of the efforts of the Galen Organization. According to a top-secret estimate declassified as a result of a Freedom of Information action taken by the author, U.S. military planning was based on the following, quote, conclusions as to the strategic intentions of the Soviet Union in the event of war in 1949, unquote. It is worth noting that these same conclusions were also used to justify Defense Department budget requests. The last sentence again, because it's a key. It is worth noting that these same conclusions were also used to justify Defense Department budget requests. A major Pentagon tool to justify the weapons or the appropriations for new weapons programs throughout the Cold War period was what is known as threat inflation. And again, the Galen Organization was able to have much of its effect on American political and social life because of the way that it interacted with domestic American political forces, the so-called military-industrial complex in particular. Now let's take a look at the 1949 estimate of Soviet capabilities. The following would be undertaken by the USSR simultaneously according to the intelligence estimate. 1. A campaign against Western Europe, including Italy and Sicily, but not the Iberian Peninsula initially, to gain the Atlantic seaboard in the shortest possible time and to control the central Mediterranean. 2. An aerial bombardment against the British Isles. 3. A campaign to seize control of the Middle East, including Greece and Turkey and the Suez Canal area. 4. A campaign against China and South Korea, and air and sea operations against Japan and the United States bases in Alaska and the Pacific, insofar as the Soviet Union can support such operations without prejudice to those in other areas. 5. Small-scale one-way air attacks against the United States and Canada, and possibly small-scale two-way air attacks against the Puget Sound area. 6. A sea and air offensive against Anglo-American sea communications. 7. Subversive activities and sabotage against Anglo-American interests in all parts of the world. 8. A campaign against Scandinavia, and air attacks on Pakistan may also be undertaken concurrently with the foregoing or as necessary. 9. On successful conclusion of the campaign in Western Europe and possibly Scandinavia, a full-scale air and sea offensive would be directed against the British Isles. 10. The Soviet Union will have sufficient armed forces to undertake campaigns simultaneously in the theaters indicated and still have sufficient armed forces to form an adequate reserve. The Soviets, again, are being seen as doing all of these things simultaneously. That is absolutely ridiculous. But it should be noted that this was the accepted view at the time. Continuing with Simpson's commentary, Russia at this stage is the world's #1 military power, headlined U.S. News and World Report in a feature story on the new crisis. Again quoting, Russia's armies and air forces are in a position to pour across Europe and into Asia almost at will, unquote. The United States have fewer than a score of divisions to stand guard against this horde and seem to be losing troops every day because of budget cutbacks and a widespread desire at home to return to normality. The Truman administration's response to this dilemma seemed obvious. Stop the cuts in the military budget, accelerate construction of the atomic weapons that appeared to offer more bang for the buck than conventional forces, and dump millions of dollars into a variety of covert operations and intelligence programs, including the newly born CIA and its chief client, the Gehlen Organization. It is clear in hindsight, however, that the estimates of Soviet military power that Gehlen provided to the Americans were simply wrong and grossly overstated both the Soviets' ability and their desire to fight. While it, quote, is still commonly believed that the Soviet Union did not demobilize its ground forces at the end of World War II, writes Matthew Evangelista in the MIT journal International Security, again quoting, this is not the case. The overall manpower strength of the Soviet armed forces were considerably exaggerated in the West during the early post-war years, unquote. By the way, Matthew Evangelista's last name, Evangelista. I would note, too, the similarity between the way that these grossly exaggerated Gehlen-originated reports of Soviet military capabilities and intention, the effect they had on American political life in the 50s is very similar to the propaganda campaign that took place in the late 70s and early 80s, which led to the enormous Reagan military buildup. Again, an enormous exaggeration of Soviet capabilities, and in turn a gross underestimating of American capabilities led to the massive arms buildup under the Reagan administration. This is a pattern that we will take a look at as we take a look at the Reagan administration as the ultimate fulfillment of rollback or liberation theory. Returning again to Simpson's analysis, Gehlen's role in the 1948 crisis was one of the first and still one of the most important examples of blowback created by the Nazi utilization programs. His seemingly authoritative intelligence reports played a very real role in shaping U.S. perceptions of the USSR during this pivotal period. Furthermore, the reports became an important ingredient in the domestic American debate over military budgets and defense policy. In those events, General Chamberlain of Army Intelligence solicited General Clay's telegram because he knew that once leaked, it would be a potent weapon in budget battles on Capitol Hill. The idea succeeded almost too well. The arrival of Clay's warning on the heels of the collapse of the government in Czechoslovakia and related crises came perilously close to triggering a war itself. Had Gehlen's role been limited to the preparation of top-secret studies for the use of America's own most expert intelligence analysis, it is unlikely that his project would have done much harm during the post-war period, and it might actually have done some good. But that is not how intelligence agencies actually work. Very important passage coming up here. Repeating again that last sentence. But that is not how intelligence agencies actually work. In reality, Contending factions in the government leak their versions of events to favored members of Congress or reporters and from them to the public at large. Quote, secret reports, unquote, revealed in this way, especially those that frighten or titillate us, take on a mystique of accuracy that is undeserved. These, quote, secrets, unquote, become potent symbols that rally constituencies whose concern is not with the accuracy of a given bit of intelligence, but rather with the use to which the leak can be put in the domestic political arena. That last sentence again. These, quote, secrets, unquote, become potent symbols that rally constituencies whose concern is not with the accuracy of a given bit of intelligence, but rather with the use to which the leak can be put in the domestic political arena. As time goes on, a self-reinforcing process sets in, each new leak lending credibility to the next, which in turn, quote, confirms, unquote, those stories that have already been revealed. Quoting, the agency, CIA, loved Galen because he fed us what we wanted to hear, unquote. Marchetti concludes, again quoting, we used his stuff constantly and we fed it to everybody else. The Pentagon, the White House, the newspapers, they loved it too. But it was hyped up Russian boogeyman junk, and it did a lot of damage to this country. So again, the effects of the Galen Organization should never be seen as existing in a vacuum, but rather the profound effect, and in my analysis, I believe the pivotal effect that the Galen Organization effected on American and world history was by acting in conjunction with major political and social forces in the United States, and that interaction between Galen and powerful domestic political forces ultimately produced the outcome of the Cold War that took place. The Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. What's left of it is bankrupt, and we are bankrupt too. A very important element of analysis is one that will figure during the course of the rest of this archive show, and it figures in a prominent way in the analysis of the U.S. having lost the Second World War. Granted, we, quote, won, unquote, the Cold War, but we are now bankrupt. We're the world's biggest debtor nation. The S&Ls are gone. The savings, the commercial banks are in bad shape. The insurance companies are in very bad shape, and they're going to be going down at some point. There's enormous corporate debt, enormous consumer debt. We're losing our industrial base. And despite the promise of a peace dividend, the fact of the matter is that because the American economy has become so dependent on defense spending, many of the elected representatives have defeated some of the weapons programs that the Pentagon itself wants to axe because basically they have a pork barrel consideration. So many of the voters that have supported them, so many of their constituents are dependent on employment in the defense industries that major weapons programs that the Pentagon wants to cut have actually been restored by members of Congress. And again, the U.S. could be thought of from an economic standpoint as to a certain extent at least being like a junkie, even though military spending per se is not particularly healthy for the economy in ways that I'll explain in a minute. At the same time, we are like a junkie. We should get the needle out of our arm. At the same time, we're dependent on that fix to keep going for the next day. One of the major dynamics that I'm going to introduce now is something which will figure in the analysis of how the U.S. lost the Second World War, and that is the dynamic of the tank versus the bulldozer. The only way that capitalism can work is for capital to be invested in such a way as to generate more capital. And capital invested in the civilian sector generates a lot more capital than capital that's invested in the military sector. Take, for example, a tank. The initial outlay for the tank comes out of taxpayers' money. It comes out of the public sector. The fuel, the ammunition, the spare parts, the paying for the crew, all of that comes out of the taxpayer's pocket. It comes out of the public sector. Although there is X amount of capital that is generated for the producers of the spare parts and for the producer of the tank. Again, the funding for that comes out of the public sector, and what does the tank do? It goes on maneuvers, it burns up fuel, it shoots ammunition. None of that really generates a whole lot of capital, beyond, again, the wages that come to the people that are employed in making the shells or the spare parts or whatever. All of the capital outlay for that tank, which does not generate very much capital in and of itself, comes out of the public sector, it comes out of the taxpayer's pocket, and it adds to the debt of the country. Now, the bulldozer, on the other hand, its construction cost is paid for out of the private sector. The cost of the people who operate it, the salaries of the people who operate it, are paid for by the private sector. The spare parts, the fuel, and everything else paid for by the private sector. It does not add to the national debt. It does not add to the yearly budget. And the bulldozer is involved in building office buildings, shopping centers, or factories, shopping centers, what have you. All of those things generate capital. A shopping center, an office building, a factory, those are facilities that employ people. That in turn generates more capital than money that is spent on a tank. Not that there isn't some capital generated by money spent on a tank, but not nearly as much as is generated on the capital spent on a bulldozer. The bulldozer produces more capital than the tank, and again, nothing is paid for. The bulldozer is not paid for out of the taxpayer's pocket. The dynamic of the tank versus the bulldozer is central to the working hypothesis that I'm developing, namely that the U.S. lost the Second World War. We have been spending our money on tanks. The Germans and Japanese have been spending their money on bulldozers. Not that they don't have strong militaries, both countries do, but they have not been spending their money on nuclear missile submarines, intercontinental ballistic missiles, these very sophisticated jet fighters, electronic warfare systems. We have. The Pentagon budgets in the Reagan-Bush years have exceeded the yearly corporate earnings of the Fortune 500 combined. And that's an awful lot of tanks and not too many bulldozers. The Soviets were completely bankrupted and ultimately disintegrated in large measure as a result of the arms race. We took a look at that in Radio Free America 36 in developing the full court press scenario. It destroyed the Soviet Union, and it has gone a long way toward doing that in the United States. What we're going to look at next in this installment of RFA 37 is another way in which the Galen organization, as well as some of the people brought over to the United States under the auspices of Project Paperclip, namely the Nazi rocket scientists, again fundamentally distorted Soviet capabilities and intentions, and this particular distortion, namely an exaggeration of Soviet ICBM capabilities, led in a significant way to the most destructive phases of the arms race. What we're going to see now is how the Galen organization and the Project Paperclip scientists, notably General Walter Dornberger, about whom we shall have more to say later in RFA 37, how they created the myth of the missile gap and substantially increased the seriousness of the arms race between the U.S. and USSR. In a footnote, Simpson goes on to add, Galen also played a role in the creation of the famous missile gap of the 1950s. Again quoting, Galen provided us, the CIA, with specific reports on the Soviet ICBM program, Victor Marchetti says, again quoting, he said, we have two reliable reports confirming this, and they, the Soviets, have just installed 3 missiles at that site, etc., claiming that he had contacts among the German scientists captured by the Russians at the end of the war. The intelligence reports were transmitted to the Pentagon through interagency channels, and word about the alarming new development eventually leaked from there into the press. Walter Dornberger, D-O-R-N-B-E-R-G-E-R, added fuel to this fire in 1955 by publishing alarming speculations that the Soviets might attack from the sea using shorter-range missiles deployed in floating canisters off the coast of the United States. He was deeply involved in the United States' own ICBM program at this point, and his opinions were given considerable weight in public discussions. The CIA soon dispatched some of the first of the revolutionary new U-2 surveillance planes on secret missions inside Soviet airspace to gather more data. Again quoting, we figured that if the Soviets had ICBMs before the U.S., that could be damn serious, unquote, Marchetti continues, again quoting, we also figured if they had them, they'd have to move them by railroad, particularly to Siberia, where they would be most useful against the United States. So we sent out Frank Powers and the U-2s, and they plotted the whole Soviet rail network. U-2s scoured the Trans-Siberian Railroad, every spur and every missile R&D station, and nothing was found that remotely resembled the implementation of an ICBM capability at that time. It was all bull, unquote. And Simpson goes on to add, by that time, however, the missile gap story had already taken on the status of a fact, one which appeared to be backed up by authoritative leaks from the Pentagon. The issue subsequently played a major role in debates over the defense budget and in several election campaigns. And I would note that John Kennedy was elected in considerable measure on a promise to close the missile gap, unquote, and that was a myth, something Kennedy probably did not even know. Again, only a handful of insiders, such as Marchetti, a Soviet affairs specialist for the CIA, were aware that, in fact, there was no, quote, missile gap. And again, this misinformation, generated both by Gehlen and fueled by General Walter Dornberger, the military commander of Peenemünde Nordhausen, the Third Reich's rocket center, this particular myth, this piece of misinformation, played a major role in the escalation of the arms race. It was one of the things that led to both the U.S. and the former Soviet Union spending their money, quote, on tanks, unquote, in this case missiles, but basically spending money on government issue rather than on capital goods, which could shore up their commercial economy. It should also be noted, too, that the tremendously exaggerated view of Soviet capabilities and intentions also contributed materially to the anti-communist paranoia of the McCarthy period, and that period served as a primary sowing area, served as very fertile soil for many of the Third Reich residua that were brought into the United States under the auspices of the Gehlen Organization and related Nazi import programs. They began to play a profound role in American political life, and in fact they were to become the seed for a potent political force in the United States, one which ultimately became the dominant political force in the United States as a result of the assassination of John Kennedy. That particular force, the liberation or rollback forces, reached their culmination in the Reagan years. And again, it should be noted that the generation of the liberation or rollback theory entails the interaction between Gehlen and related elements and very, very powerful political forces in the United States. Although the genesis of the rollback or liberation theory goes all the way back to Third Reich political warfare techniques, the way in which they were able to exert a dominant influence on the United States in the post-World War II period was as a result of the interaction between Gehlen and Gehlen-related elements and powerful domestic American political forces. This last passage, before a musical break, will serve as a transition to our analysis of the formation of rollback or liberation theory. Simpson writes in Blowback, one of the most important characteristics of the war criminals who did come to the United States is that they did not arrive here as isolated individuals. As has been seen in the case of the Croatian Ustashi, the Ukrainian OUN, and the Latvian Vanagis, V-A-N-A-G-I-S, to name only three, many of these immigrants were in fact part of experienced, highly organized groups with distinct political agendas that differed little from the fascist programs they had promoted in their homelands. The anti-communist paranoia of the McCarthy period gave these groups fertile soil in which to put down roots and to grow. And what we're going to look at next, after a musical break, is how these groups put down roots and how, as a direct result of CIA political action, covert political action in the United States, these groups formed the core group of the rollback or liberation theory of fighting the Cold War, which became a dominant American political force. That analysis after a musical break in the next installment of Radio Free America 37. We're going to continue now with this installment of Radio Free America program number 37, How the United States Lost the Second World War. And again, central to the entire hypothesis that I'm developing is the concept of the tank versus the bulldozer. Not only do tanks add to the public debt they're paid for, and all the parts, the spare, the fuel, etc., paid for by the taxpayer, but beyond that, it should be noted that over the period of the Cold War, an increasing percentage or an increasing amount of America's R&D brains have been devoted to defense spending rather than to updating and upgrading our commercial economies. That also exerted a tremendously destructive effect on the United States. And at some point, I suspect that the destructive effect of the arms race on both the U.S. and the USSR became a major strategic consideration for the Third Reich elements, which, as we have seen in Radio Free America #2 and in a miscellaneous archive show called The New Germany and the Old Nazis, those elements remained in place in Germany. Many of them are in dominant positions today. What we're going to look at now, and again, we've been taking a look at the way in which the Gehlen organization was able to provide grossly exaggerated analyses of what the Soviet Union was capable of militarily and what it intended to do, and how those analyses fitted into the agendas of very powerful domestic political forces, both American reactionaries, the so-called military-industrial complex, and how the interaction between this Gehlen disinformation and the needs and desires of these powerful domestic political forces gave impetus to the Cold War. I'll also recall that the Gehlen organization itself served to aggravate the Soviets' attitude as well. They were aware of the Gehlen organization and its incorporation into the United States as early as the Potsdam Conference in 1945. What we're going to look at now is the evolution of a Third Reich political warfare and covert action technique, namely the, quote, liberation, unquote, doctrine. And we're going to look at how this Third Reich political warfare technique and doctrine evolved into a major American political force, as well as an American political warfare and covert action doctrine. This as the result of the injection by CIA domestic organizations of many of these same Gehlen and Gehlen-related Third Reich alumni into American political life. And the formation of this liberation or rollback milieu is ultimately what we're going to look at here is the creation of the milieu that we looked at in the first two installments of Radio Free America #37, this intersection of the American radical right, the national security establishment, and many of the Gehlen and ABN-related elements that we took a look at in connection with the assassination of John Kennedy, which, among other things, represented the triumph, the formal triumph of rollback or liberation theory of fighting the Cold War, and that triumph saw its culmination in the Reagan and Bush years. In a very important chapter in Christopher Simpson's Blowback entitled The Politics of Liberation, we find the Central Intelligence Agency did not sever its ties with the extremist exile organizations once they arrived in this country. Instead, it continued to use them in clandestine operations both abroad and in the United States itself. Before the middle of the 1950s, the agency found itself entangled with dozens and probably hundreds of former Nazis and SS men who had fought their way into the leadership of a variety of Eastern European émigré political associations inside this country. Instead of withdrawing its support for the extremist groups and for the men and women who led them, the CIA went to considerable lengths to portray these leaders as legitimate representatives of the countries they had fled. At about the same time that the agency initiated the immigration programs discussed in the last chapter, it dramatically expanded its publicity and propaganda efforts inside the United States itself. A major theme of this effort was to establish the credibility and legitimacy of exiled Eastern European politicians, former Nazi collaborators and non-collaborators alike, in the eyes of the American public. Through the National Committee for a Free Europe, or NCFE, and a new CIA-financed group, the Crusade for Freedom, or CFF, the Covert Operations Division of the agency became instrumental in introducing into the American political mainstream many of the right-wing extremist émigré politicians' plans to, quote, liberate, unquote, Eastern Europe and to, quote, roll back communism, unquote. Last sentence again, because it's in many ways the key to this chapter. Through the National Committee for a Free Europe, or NCFE, and a new CIA-financed group, the Crusade for Freedom, or CFF, the Covert Operations Division of the agency became instrumental in introducing into the American political mainstream many of the right-wing extremist émigré politicians' plans to, quote, liberate, unquote, Eastern Europe and to, quote, roll back communism, unquote. And now here again, we're going to take a look at how the CFF, the Crusade for Freedom, a CIA domestic organization, which was the vehicle to a large extent for interjecting many of these same Third Reich alumni and these same Gehlen-related elements into American political life, and for propagating their views into a mainstream American political force. One of the major motivations for doing this, again, was to generate popular American support for an arms buildup which was perceived as needed to counteract the Soviet threat, which we have seen was already greatly exaggerated in the minds of American strategic and political thinkers by the Gehlen disinformation that we looked at in our last segment. And again, many of these same Gehlen-related elements will now take a major role, or will play a major role in the formation of American political theory. Simpson writes, "At the time, however, it seemed to many that the only possible response to the crisis precipitated by Korea and the Soviet atomic tests was a major escalation of U.S. weapons programs coupled with intensified clandestine campaigns to undermine Soviet rule everywhere it had been established. The price tag for the U.S. arms buildup, according to Paul Nitze, N-I-T-Z-E, who drafted most of the main policy statements on the issue, was some $50 billion, almost 3 times the then existing U.S. military budget. The real question for U.S. policymakers of the day," write Walter Isaacson and Evan Thomas in their study of American policy formulation, The Wise Men, quote, "was whether Congress and the administration would pay for it. The public had to be persuaded. The way to do that, Nitze knew from experience, was to scare them, to tell them that the Soviets were intent on world domination, that they were poised to attack, and that the U.S. had to meet them everywhere," unquote. It was in this context that the CIA launched a major propaganda effort in the United States. Despite a legal prohibition against domestic activities by the agency, it initiated a multi-million-dollar publicity project in this country called the Crusade for Freedom. And skipping down, in reality, one of the most important reasons for the CFF was to bring to America the analysis of foreign affairs that had been developed by the National Committee for a Free Europe and by the CIA. The CFF became a gigantic nationwide drive, unquote, as our Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty director Sig Mickelson has put it, quote, "to obtain support for the activities of the Free Europe Committee," unquote. The basic message of that analysis was a more aggressive, hard-hitting version of the containment doctrine that would soon come to be known as, quote, liberation, unquote. So stopping to look at what we've seen so far in the analysis of the formation of the liberation milieu, which ultimately was central to the dispatching of President Kennedy and which came to its fruition, its ultimate culmination in the Reagan-Bush years, many of these Gehlen Third Reich Eastern European Gehlen-related Third Reich Eastern European emigres and fascist collaborators are projected into American political life as a result of domestic CIA operations, the chief one among them the Crusade for Freedom. One of the main reasons for doing this was to generate public support for the arms buildup that many American political and military leaders felt was necessary to counter the Soviet threat, which, as we've seen, was already being greatly exaggerated by the Gehlen disinformation that was presented to the United States. And in turn, the goal of the CFF was to bring the analysis of foreign affairs that was developed by the National Committee for a Free Europe, a CIA front, and by the CIA itself, and by extension also the Gehlen organization, to bring to the American public an awareness, the same awareness of the analysis that was dominant within the U.S. national security structure. Skipping down, what we're going to look at now is the evolution of the liberation or rollback philosophy of fighting the Cold War from a Third Reich political warfare technique, because it was begun during the Third Reich, or actually during the Third Reich before World War II, and we're going to look at its evolution into a mainstream American political force. Simpson writes, although it was little known in the United States at the time, the genesis of the liberation philosophy can be clearly traced to émigré propagandists who had worked for the Nazis on the Eastern Front during World War II. After the war, the various conservative and liberal anti-communist organizations in the United States that adopted liberation as a rallying cry added new and specifically American elements to the program that altered the earlier German strategy in basic ways. Liberation, in its American version, included an insistence that the anti-communist revolution be democratic rather than fascist in character, and it abandoned the racial theories and anti-Semitism of the earlier Nazi propaganda. Liberation, in the United States' hands, was billed as the fulfillment of America's own revolutionary heritage of resistance to tyranny. I would interject at this point, from the vantage point of 1992, we can look back and see that, in fact, in at least some of the, quote, liberated, unquote, areas, many of these same fascist philosophies are very much alive today, newly independent Croatia being but one example. Continuing. It is useful to look at the gradual evolution of how these changes took place. The political rhetoric of the extremist exile groups that had once worked for the Nazis also evolved in a complex interaction with the gradual introduction of liberationist thinking into America. By the late 1940s, exiled extremist leaders had learned the rhetoric of this new, more, quote, American, unquote, form of liberation. Their adoption of lip service to democracy began to provide former fascists with a platform to promote their agenda to millions of Americans, and it created a shelter, in effect, that protected them from the exposure of their Nazi pasts. That last sentence again. Their adoption of lip service to democracy began to provide former fascists with a platform to promote their agenda to millions of Americans, and it created a shelter, in effect, that protected them from the exposure of their Nazi pasts. They were no longer seen as the triggermen of Nazi genocide in the public mind, but rather as fervent anti-communist patriots. The government's intelligence agencies played a substantial role in this shift. The changes in the rhetoric of the extreme Russian nationalist organization Nationalno Trudzovoy Soyuz, or NTS, which is still active in today's Russian emigration, are a case in point. By the way, interjecting, we took a look at the NTS and the participation of NTS elements such as Igor Voshinin in the assassination of John Kennedy in our first two segments. Continuing. This once openly fascist group was founded in the early 1930s by a congress of younger Russian exiles who had fled their homeland in the wake of the 1917 revolution. During the first decade of its existence, the NTS proclaimed the Nazis as models. NTS members were contemptuous of any sort of democratic norms and of the United States, which they viewed as degenerate. Their party program called for an anti-communist revolution in the USSR, assassination of Soviet leaders, disenfranchisement of Jews, and confiscation of Jewish property. When war broke out, the NTS unhesitatingly rallied to the cause of Nazi Germany. NTS strategy during the conflict, that's World War II, centered on an attempt to convince the Germans to sponsor its members as the new rulers of a puppet state inside the Nazi-occupied zone of the USSR. They gradually became a central part of the Germans' Vlasov Army political warfare project, serving as political officers and informers among the Eastern European troops who had defected to the Nazis. Recall, the Vlasov Liberation Army was a group of Soviet turncoats who fought on behalf of the Third Reich during World War II. They also became a key component of the Gehlen organization both during and after World War II, when it worked for first the Third Reich and then for the CIA and ultimately West Germany and NATO. Continuing. As a declassified U.S. State Department study on the group puts it, the NTS, quote, served in the good graces of the Germans, and it placed its men under the Kriegsgefangenenkommissionen, part of the Nazi prisoner of war camp administration, frequently used for interrogation and recruitment of defectors, into the special training camps for politically reliable prisoners, and above all, into the propagandist schools at Wüstgrau and Dabendorf, as well as into Goebbels' Anti-Comintern, a Nazi-sponsored alliance of fascist parties from around the world. Graduates of the NTS training program, the study continues, quote, were assigned to positions in German-occupied Russia, such as chiefs of police, deputy mayors, and propagandists with army units, unquote. Many of the NTS leaders of the 1950s, particularly those who served as police and city administrators in the Nazi occupation zone, are major war criminals who personally helped organize the identification, roundup, and execution of millions of Jewish and Slavic citizens. Insofar as NTS men won control of local administrations in the Nazi-occupied regions of the USSR, the organization became an integral part of the Nazis' propaganda, espionage, and extermination apparatus in the East. The main theme of NTS propaganda throughout the conflict was a campaign to, quote, liberate, unquote, the USSR from Stalin, communism, and the Jews through a mutiny by the Red Army. Recall that we looked at this passage in an earlier installment of RFA 37. Ultimately, that mutiny by the Red Army, the basic tactic espoused by the NTS, was realized with the August coup of 1991 and the resultant mutiny by the Army, which was to result in the outlawing of the Soviet Communist Party and the very dissolution of the Soviet Union itself, a goal long sought by the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, as we looked at earlier in this series. By the way, it's worth noting, too, that the extreme Russian nationalist organization, we'll touch on this later, the extreme Russian nationalist organization Pamyat, P-A-M-Y-A-T, is extremely anti-Semitic, and to a certain extent at least, Pamyat could be seen as the ultimate successor to the NTS, and at least to a certain extent as the realization of some of the political goals that the NTS sought. Continuing with this particular passage from Simpson's Blowback. Of the proposed mutiny by the Red Army to, quote, liberate, unquote, the USSR from Stalin, Simpson says, this became the centerpiece of Vlasov Army recruiting efforts at least as early as 1942 and was elaborated in considerable detail with tactics for counterinsurgency operations in the Nazi occupation zone, behind-the-lines infiltration of NTS agents on espionage and sabotage missions, propaganda themes tailored to appeal to Russian sensibilities, and similar specifics. When the Germans were finally driven out of Russia, selected NTS agents were left on, quote, stay-behind, unquote, missions in an attempt to organize subversion in Soviet rear areas once the Red Army front had passed. The NTS also served as the dominant force after the Nazis themselves, and the Russkaya Osvoboditel and Osvoboditelnaya Armia, the Russian Army of Liberation or Vlasov Army, and the Komitet Osvobozhdenia Narodov Rossi, German-sponsored Committee for the Liberation of the Peoples of Russia, the Nazis' primary front group for Eastern Front political warfare operations in the desperate closing months of the war. By the way, some spellings of foreign names. Kriegsgefangenenkommissionen is Kriegsgefangenenkommissionen, and the Russian names, the Russkaya Osvoboditel Naya Armia, RUSSKAJA, OSVOBODITEL, NAIA, capital ARMIIA, and the Komitet Osvobozhdenia is OZVOBOZHDENIIA, and Narodov, NARODOV, Rossai, ROSSII. Continuing with Simpson's text, it was through the NTS and through the rival National Liberation Program sponsored among Soviet minority groups by the Nazis' Rosenberg Ministry that the strategy and tactics of the liberation of the USSR were first hammered out. These were the laboratories, so to speak, used by Hans Heinrich Herwarth, Gustav Hilger, and the other German political warfare officers discussed earlier to develop the propaganda themes and behind-the-line subversion tactics believed most suitable for reaching people inside the USSR. We're now going to take a look at the evolution of this Nazi political war, Third Reich political warfare and covert action strategy, and see how it evolves into a mainstream, ultimately a dominant American political force. We're going to look at an NTS member here who ultimately was projected into the United States as a, quote, Soviet expert. This guy, by the way, had worked in directing slave labor gangs for the SS. His name is Konstantin Boldyrev, B-O-L-D-Y-R-E-F-F. Simpson writes of him, Konstantin Boldyrev was a founder of NTS and a senior leader of the group throughout the war. His wartime career is shrouded in secrecy today, but it is clear that the Counterintelligence Corps believed that in late 1944 he helped administer gangs of Russian laborers for the SS. He is a case in point of the manner in which the intervention of U.S. intelligence agencies shepherded the migration of liberation propaganda out of the fallen wartime ministries of Berlin and into the living rooms of America. The last sentence again. He is a case in point of the manner in which the intervention of U.S. intelligence agencies shepherded the migration of liberation propaganda out of the fallen wartime ministries of Berlin and into the living rooms of America. According to U.S. Army intelligence records obtained under the Freedom of Information Act, the mainstream U.S. anti-communist organization Common Cause, no relation to the present-day liberal organization of the same name, sponsored the NTS spokesman's travels to the United States in 1948, then gave him a media campaign that enabled him to reach into millions of American homes during the late 1940s and early 1950s. Common Cause was a prototype of, and a sister organization to, the CIA-sponsored National Committee for a Free Europe. Its directors included many of the men, Adolf Burley, Arthur Bliss Lane, and Eugene Lyons, among others, who simultaneously led CIA-financed groups such as the NCFE and later the American Committee for Liberation from Bolshevism. Boldereff's speaking and writing tour in this country became one of the first rallying cries in the United States for a liberationist political agenda. The campaign aimed at winning financial and popular support for the NTS as a weapon in clandestine warfare against the USSR. And this account of Boldereff goes on to describe how his views were widely publicized through both the electronic and print media. We're going to see that phenomenon in just a few minutes, not with Boldereff specifically, but with others. Now, one of the points that Simpson makes in his next section is the point that many of the Galen-related émigrés who came to play a pivotal role in the formation of liberation or rollback philosophy, and this again as a result of their projection into a domestic American political life by CIA domestic organizations such as the Crusade for Freedom, that one of the goals sought by many of these Galen-related émigrés was the precipitation of a war between the United States and the Soviet Union to the end, with the effect of having these very same émigrés installed in the Soviet Union as political leaders after the defeat of the USSR. Now recall, that is basically the same goal that the NTS had vis-a-vis the Third Reich. They ultimately sought to prevail on the Third Reich to install them as the leaders of a Third Reich puppet state in the former USSR. And it should be noted here that what we're looking at is essentially a foreign agenda, an agenda originally developed by elements associated with the Third Reich, such as the NTS, and we are looking at the proposed use of the United States by these elements in the same capacity that they attempted to use Nazi Germany. Namely, they sought to use the U.S. as a tool for defeating the USSR and ultimately projecting themselves into the political leadership of what would have been the USSR. And also take note of the fact that the political influence of many of these groups was greatly expanded by the sympathies they were able to generate within many of the large ethnic voting blocks within American cities. Many American cities have large Eastern European émigré communities, and many of these same Third Reich and Galen-related elements were able to find very responsive audiences and influential audiences within these particular communities. Simpson writes, "The émigré anti-communist movement continued to accelerate. Soon there emerged in the United States, quote, one vocal and not uninfluential element that not only wanted war with Russia, but had a very clear idea of the purposes for which in its own view such a war should be fought," unquote, as George Kennan noted later in a discussion of his views on the possibility of war with the USSR during the early 1950s. Quote, "I have in mind the escapees and immigrants, mostly recent ones from the non-Russian portions of the post-war Soviet Union, as well as from some of the Eastern European satellite states. Quote, their idea," he writes, "to which they were passionately and sometimes ruthlessly attached, was simply that the United States should, for their benefit, fight a war against the Russian people to achieve the final breakup of the traditional Russian state and the establishment of themselves as the regimes of the various, quote, liberated, unquote, territories," unquote. Keenan is referring here to the spokesman of the so-called captive nations movement, particularly Ukrainian and Baltic nationalists. I would interject here, ultimately, as we can see from 1992, that goal was achieved not through the fighting of a hot war, but rather through the successful prosecution, or at least successful, from their standpoint, prosecution of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was indeed bankrupted. There was indeed a mutiny by the Red Army following the attempted August 1991 coup. The Soviet Union, in alliance with the goals of the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, did indeed break up into its constituent ethnic republics. And as we looked at in Radio Free America program number 36, organizations like the RUK organization, RUKH in the Ukraine, which looks for its political heritage to the OUN B group of Stefan Bandera, who we looked at earlier in RFA 37, as well as organizations like Sejudis in Lithuania, which basically takes its political heritage from Lithuania's fascist period prior to World War II and its occupation by the Soviets. We basically see the successful realization of the agendas of these groups as a result of the U.S. basically fighting the Cold War and bankrupting the Soviet Union, and pretty much bankrupting itself in the process. So again, the goals sought here, originally goals of Third Reich political warfare vis-à-vis the Soviet Union and covert action, have been realized as a result of their incorporation into the United States. We'll take a look at just how this happened in subsequent installments of RFA 37. We also took a look at RFA 36. In RFA 36, I should say, we took a look at this process in detail. But note that the liberation philosophy, originally a Third Reich political warfare and covert action strategy, introduced into the United States as a result of domestic action by CIA organizations, chiefly the CFF, which projected many of these same Gehlen-related elements into the American political mainstream, where their philosophy became a dominant American political force. Ultimately, their goal, beginning as a Third Reich political warfare technique, has been realized, and many of these same elements are indeed in the driver's seat in not only the member republics of the former Soviet Union, but some of the Eastern European states as well, notably the aforementioned Croatia, where Franjo Tudjman, the current head of Croatia, denies the Holocaust and has pretty much revived the whole Ustashi agenda, something which has been eclipsed in all of the publicity concerning the Serbian atrocities or alleged atrocities towards the Bosnians. There have certainly been some atrocities. I suspect that there's also been some exaggeration. Continuing with Simpson's account, these recent refugees were by no means without political influence in Washington, Keenan adds. Connected as they were with the compact voting bloc situated in the big cities, they were able to bring direct influence to bear on individual congressional figures. They appealed successfully at times to religious feelings and, even more importantly, to the prevailing anti-communist hysteria, unquote. Among the countries the captive nations movement represented were several that the diplomat admits had been, quote, invented in the Nazi propaganda ministry during the war, unquote. Agitation by these émigrés became a part of dozens of CIA-sponsored exile operations in the United States during the early 1950s. Almost all these affairs were sponsored by the CIA Covert Operations Directorate's International Organizations Division, which was then administering the NCFE, the CFF, and similar overlapping projects. This division organized and bankrolled the CFF with an initial grant of $180,000, according to former RFE-RL, that's Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty Chief Mickelson, or Radio Liberation Chief Mickelson, M-I-C-K-E-L-S-O-N. The CIA, working through the NCFE, then went on to pour at least $5 million into CFF propaganda work inside the United States over the next 5 years. I would interject that $5 million in the early 50s was many times what it is worth, was worth many times what $5 million would be worth today. Continuing. That $5 million figure is only a pale reflection of the true scope of the CFF's effort, however. The campaign arranged with the Nonprofit Advertising Council of America for thousands of hours of free radio and television time, as well as for countless free magazine and newspaper promotions. The crusade paid only for the actual production of the proliferation of the pro-liberation political advertising, which was then broadcast or published without charge by media outlets enjoying substantial tax deductions for airing these, quote, public service, unquote, announcements. This unique program, quote, made it possible for the American people to read, hear, and see the crusade story in all media of communications, unquote, the National Committee for a Free Europe boasted in an annual report, including, quote, newspapers, magazines, outdoor advertising, radio, television, and newsreels, unquote. But the CIA's $5 million direct contribution to anti-communist education through the CFF can serve at least as a yardstick for comparing the scope of the crusade promotion to other political propaganda efforts undertaken in this country at about the same time. That $5 million contribution exceeds, for example, the combined total of all the money spent on the Truman-Dewey presidential election campaign of 1948. It establishes the CIA, through the CFF, as the largest single political advertiser on the American scene during the early 1950s, rivaled only by such commercial giants as General Motors and Procter & Gamble in its domination of the airwaves. So again, not only does the CFF's $5 million contribution coming from the CIA exceed the combined cost of the Truman-Dewey presidential election campaign in '48, it placed the CIA and CFF as the largest single political advertiser on the American scene in this period, and basically rivaling commercial giants like GM and Procter & Gamble as the main advertisers on the American airwaves. And note, as Simpson has documented here, as he has discussed, that in addition to the $5 million, a great deal of free advertising was obtained by these very same groups, and that in turn greatly expanded the influence of the CFF with its Galen and related emigre people at the core of not only their political organizations, but at the core of their philosophical generation as well. Continuing here with Simpson's account, what we're going to look at now is a related program in which CIA-sponsored organizations not only took to the airwaves, but basically sponsored scholastic propaganda/research on behalf of many of these same Galen Third Reich emigre organizations and individuals, and again, this by way of propagating the rollback or liberation philosophy into American society, where it became a dominant political force. And once again, I want to reiterate that the actions of these organizations and the CFF, the Galen-related elements, these Eastern European and fascist exiles, or emigres, I should say, they should not be seen as operating in a vacuum, but rather the effect they had was precisely as a result of their interaction with other major American domestic political forces, and basically what we're looking at is the formation of what might be termed a community of interests, what the Germans referred to as an Interessengemeinschaft. Although the organizations worked together, some of their motivations were differing to a certain extent, overlapping but not coterminous. So again, the profound influence that these Galen-related elements had in American society as a result of their projection into American political life by the CIA was as a result of the way in which they were able to interact with major domestic political forces. Continuing with Simpson's account, the crusade was only part of a much broader CIA-sponsored effort to shape U.S. and world public opinion. Related programs included book publishing, scholarly studies of the USSR by carefully selected researchers, and bankrolling hundreds of rallies, commemorations, and other media events. The principal political point of this program was to provide extensive publicity for all available evidence that the USSR was a dangerous imperial power. The agency went on to emphasize news of the, quote, liberation movements of the exiles as an important morale booster and an illustration of the resistance to Soviet expansion. The CIA financed a literary campaign explicitly designed to promote former Nazi collaborators as appropriate leaders of liberation movements among their respective nationalities. That last sentence again, because it's a key. The CIA financed a literary campaign explicitly designed to promote former Nazi collaborators as appropriate leaders of liberation movements among their respective nationalities. The German author Heinz Bongartz, pen name Jürgen Torwald, recounts how he was approached in 1950 by a CIA officer named Pleasants with a proposal that he write a promotional account of the Vlasov Army for distribution in both the United States and Europe. Spellings here, by the way. Heinz Bongartz is Bongartz. Jürgen Torwald is Jurgen, and of course Pleasants is like pleasant with an S. Continuing. Pleasants had read an earlier Bongartz tract that was strongly sympathetic to Vlasov and, quote, he thought I would be the right fellow to write further material on the subject, Bongartz remembers. The German author accepted Pleasants' offer. The CIA, with the cooperation of Hans Danko Hera, a senior officer in the Gehlen organization, provided him with stenographers, translators, travel expenses, a substantial grant, access to secret U.S. records, and assistance in locating SS and Vlasov Army veterans scattered all over Europe. Now, the spelling of this Gehlen operative who collaborated with the CIA's Pleasants and Heinz Bongartz, a.k.a. Jürgen Torwald, his name is Heinz Danko, D-A-N-K-O-H-E-R-R-E. Continuing with Simpson's account, Bongartz's glowing report of Vlasov was published in German and English 2 years later, and it remains an often cited work in the field. The book presents a thoroughly whitewashed picture of the Vlasov movement, but Bongartz deserves credit at least for openly discussing the sponsors of his book, more than can be said for a number of other scholars of the period. This broad-based, multifaceted effort legitimized for many Americans what the extreme right-wing émigré movement had been saying since the end of World War II. The United States could easily liberate Eastern Europe from the Soviet Union and even dismember the USSR, the theory went, by bankrolling stepped-up subversion programs in the East. Quote, it became an article of faith that the USSR was going to fall apart at any time, unquote, notes scholar Vladimir Petrov, P-E-T-R-O-V. By the way, calling him a scholar here is perhaps giving him a little more credit than he deserves. He is part and parcel of this whole Gehlen milieu that we're looking at this evening. Continuing, quote, the idea was that communism was a small conspiracy of men sending out the revolution, that it was hated by the people, and so naturally they wanted to overthrow it right away. Communists killed people to maintain their power, so the first chance the people had, there would be a rebellion. John Foster Dulles articulated this myth neatly in one congressional testimony that went entirely unchallenged at the time. Some dozen people in the Kremlin, he proclaimed, are seeking to consolidate their imperial rule over some 800 million people, representing what were nearly a score of independent nations. Unquote. With those kinds of odds, 800 million against 12, the overthrow of communism from within would seem like a fairly simple task. Quote, that was the theory at the time, unquote, Petrov says, again quoting, there was a lot of enthusiasm. Many people thought that communism could be very simply gotten rid of, unquote, but in reality, Petrov reflects with a sigh, this just wasn't true, unquote. The liberation message struck an extraordinarily responsive chord in the United States, one which reverberated far beyond the relatively narrow community of Eastern European exiles. Its potent blend of anti-communist paranoia, American patriotism, and the self-perceived generosity of doing something practical to aid people seen as suffering from persecution abroad appealed to millions of Americans. Skipping down. The role of former Nazi collaborators and U.S. intelligence agencies in promoting the penetration of liberationist political thinking into the American body politic may be traced through several clear steps. First, the rhetoric and the detailed strategies for the, quote, liberation, unquote, of the USSR and Eastern Europe were originally generated before World War II by pro-fascist émigré organizations enjoying direct sponsorship from Nazi Germany's intelligence agencies, which were intent on using these groups as pawns in their plans to exterminate European Jewry and to achieve a military victory in the East. The Nazis significantly developed both the liberation strategies and their exile constituencies during the war, despite the Germans' own internal faction fighting over how to make best use of the collaborators. last sentence, couple of sentences again. Now bear in mind, too, that in addition to the media blitz conducted by the Crusade for Freedom and their allied free media publicity, a major campaign of scholarship, of research and publishing to promote these same ideas, the liberationist thinking, was also conducted. Again, we took a look at Jürgen Torvald, a.k.a. Heinz Bongartz, and how the CIA and a Galen operative named Heinz Donk O'Hara were utilized to help generate his particular book. That is but one example of it. But again, the basic thesis of the generation of liberation is stated in these next few sentences by Simpson. The role of former Nazi collaborators and U.S. intelligence agencies in promoting the penetration of liberationist political thinking into the American body politic may be traced through several clear steps. First, the rhetoric and the detailed strategies for the, quote, liberation, unquote, of the USSR and Eastern Europe were originally generated before World War II by pro-fascist émigré organizations enjoying direct sponsorship from Nazi Germany's intelligence agencies, which were intent on using these groups as pawns in their plans to exterminate European Jewry and to achieve a military victory in the East. The Nazis significantly developed both the liberation strategies and their exile constituencies during the war, despite the Germans' own internal faction fighting over how to make best use of the collaborators. Secondly, after the war, U.S. intelligence agencies brought leaders of a number of these pro-fascist groups, the Ukrainian OUN, the Russian nationalist NTS, the Albanian Bali Kombatar, B-A-L-L-I, capital K-O-M-B-E-T-A-R, certain of the Baltic Nazi collaborators, etc., into the United States through programs, the specific purpose of which was in part the generation of effective anti-communist propaganda. Next, these same exile leaders aggressively promoted essentially the same liberation propaganda in the United States that they had advocated under Nazi sponsorship, though now with a new appeal to American values such as democracy and freedom, rather than the earlier open advocacy of racial politics and fascism. The CIA gave these domestic publicity campaigns multi-million-dollar clandestine backing during the 1950s by providing operating cash, salaries, and logistic and publishing support, and, not least, by facilitating endorsements from respected mainstream politicians. Now, in the next section of blowback about liberation philosophy, we're going to see the evolution of this Third Reich political and clandestine warfare strategy, and we will see how, through the steps enumerated by Simpson in the passage I just finished, this evolved into a major influence on the 1952 Republican campaign, and this by way of taking a look at the evolution of this Third Reich political warfare strategy into a dominant American political force. Also note here that the main Republican spokesman the main Republican functionary, I should say, in helping to promote the liberation philosophy as a major element of the 1952 Republican campaign platform is a fellow named Arthur Bliss Lane, L-A-N-E, Bliss, of course, B-L-I-S-S. Now, at the same time as he was serving as the point man for the Republicans' liberation plank, or for their liberation philosophy, he was also serving on the board of directors for both the CIA's National Committee for a Free Europe and the Crusade for Freedom. So at the same time as he's working with the Republican Party, he's also working for the CIA's NCFE and CFF, which are instrumental, again, in promoting liberationist philosophy in the United States. And as we will see, and as Simpson notes, ultimately, the liberation philosophy of the Republican Party and the CFF's program became virtually indistinguishable, and of course Arthur Bliss Lane is a dominant factor in both. Simpson writes of the evolution of liberation or rollback philosophy into a major influence on the Republican 1952 presidential campaign, and he describes it as follows. Neither the Eastern European exile community in America, nor still less the minority of former Nazi collaborators among them, had the political muscle to force adoption of a liberation agenda on the American public by themselves. But they could, and did often serve as catalysts that helped trigger the much bigger political, quote, chemical reaction, unquote, so to speak, that was then underway, the primary ingredients of which were East-West disputes over economic and military spheres of influence. The first, and in some ways most credible spokesman in the United States for liberationist thinking, were exiled activists who were, like NTS executive Konstantin Boldyrev, discussed above, quote, well known to American intelligence and vouched for by high American officials, unquote. Their message and slogans caught on with millions of Americans during the first half of the 1950s, especially among conservatives and others alarmed by the spread of communism abroad. In 1952, the public support in the United States for threats to liberate Eastern Europe and the USSR from their communist governments was sufficiently broad that the Republican Party adopted an explicit call for liberation as the main foreign policy plank in its party platform and as a central theme in its presidential and congressional election campaigns. Again, in 1952, the public support in the United States for threats to liberate Eastern Europe and the USSR from their communist governments was sufficiently broad that the Republican Party adopted an explicit call for liberation as the main foreign policy plank in its party platform and as a central theme in its presidential and congressional election campaigns. The Republicans' campaign platform demanded, quote, the end of the negative, futile, and immoral policy of, quote, containment, unquote, as the New York Times reported, again quoting, which abandons countless human beings to a despotism and godless terrorism, unquote. The GOP pledged to, quote, revive the contagious, liberating influences that are inherent in freedom and to mark the, quote, beginning of the end, unquote, for Communist Party rule in Eastern Europe and the USSR. America, the Republicans' primary foreign policy spokesman... America, the Republicans' primary foreign platform... America, the Republicans' primary foreign policy spokesman John Foster Dulles wrote in Life magazine, quote, wants and expects liberation to occur, unquote. This anti-communist revolution, he claimed disingenuously, would come about, quote, peacefully, unquote. The Republicans used this liberation rhetoric as a means of distinguishing their promises of a new, tougher foreign policy from the program of the Democrats. What exactly Eisenhower intended to do to promote the liberation of Eastern Europe once the election campaign was over, however, was usually left vague. Arthur Bliss Lane, who had been U.S. ambassador to Poland during the Truman years, became the point man in the Republican Party's effort to swing the enthusiasm created by the Crusade for Freedom into the GOP's column during the 1952 election. Lane's inspiration was to attract the large Slavic and Eastern European voting blocs in the United States, which had traditionally voted for Democratic candidates, to the Republican Party through demagogic promises to, quote, liberate, unquote, their former homelands with American assistance. Along with his party assignment, Lane, as noted earlier, simultaneously served on the boards of both the NCFE and the CFF, and he was an indefatigable speaker and promoter on behalf of each of his causes. Soon, Republican election tactics in ethnic communities paralleled the CIA's Crusade for Freedom campaign so closely that considerable political sophistication was required to distinguish one from the other. The party-sponsored Committee of Crusades to Lift the Iron Curtain, Liberation Centers, Liberation Week festivities, and Liberation rallies designed to draw ethnic voters into the Republican camp. These campaigns imitated and sometimes overlapped the CFF's Freedom Weeks, Baltic Freedom Days, and Freedom Rallies. Speakers and local activists of the True Crusades were frequently the same people. Several of Lane's top ethnic advisors personified the gradual evolution from World War II collaboration into Cold War liberation advocacy that has been seen in the CIA's propaganda programs. Lane's specialist in Republican Party appeals to Americans of Russian and Ukrainian ethnic descent, for example, was the scholar and publicist Vladimir Petrov, P-E-T-R-O-V. Petrov, a survivor of Stalin's prison camps in the 1930s, had defected to the Germans early in the war and spent much of the conflict assigned to a Nazi-sponsored propaganda group in Vienna according to his own account, and as a publicist promoting Vlasov's, quote, Russian Army of Liberation, unquote. Petrov also served as a Quisling city administrator in Krasnodar in the USSR during the Nazi occupation. Krasnodar is Krasnodar, by the way. Continuing. He insisted in a recent interview that he had no knowledge when he was serving in Krasnodar of the Nazis' gas truck extermination program which was introduced in Krasnodar during Petrov's tenure as transportation and finance chief. The Germans killed at least 7,000 people in this manner during Petrov's brief time in office, then used collaborationist militia troops to shoot others in tank ditches on the outskirts of town. During the 1952 election campaign, Petrov served both as an advisor to Lane and as a leading Russian-language journalist in the ethnic press in this country. The gradual merging of the Republicans' election campaign and the crusade for freedom reached its logical culmination on the eve of the 1952 election. The party's ethnic division under Lane approved and allocated money for a psychological warfare tactic that had earlier been used by the CIA in Italy and Eastern Europe. Millions of yellow leaflets were slated to be dropped from airplanes, quote, over places such as Hamtramck, unquote, the large immigrant community near Detroit, plugging Eisenhower and blaming Democrat Adlai Stevenson for the, quote, betrayal, unquote, of the Slavic, quote, fatherland and relatives, unquote, to the communists. Hamtramck, by the way, is Hamtramck. Continuing. The yellow paper was to dramatize the leaflet's conclusion. Quote, if you men and women of Polish and Czech descent can, after reading the above, vote for the Democratic candidate, the handbill proclaimed, you are as yellow as this paper. Everything was ready to go within 48 hours, according to correspondence in Lane's archives, but Eisenhower's inner circle of election advisors canceled the plan at the last minute. Eisenhower's election campaign was successful in any event. Lane's, quote, ethnic, unquote, campaign produced mixed results. The Republicans did draw substantially more votes from ethnic districts than they had been able to do previously, according to contemporary reports, although the Democratic Party's influence in these wards was by no means extinguished. In any case, the majority of American voters backed Eisenhower, at least in part because of his pro-liberation, quote, let's get tough with the communists foreign policy stance. In January of 1953, the first Republican administration in 20 years entered Washington with a grand inaugural parade and a rhetorical commitment at least to a mission to liberate Eastern Europe from communist rule. Now again, summing up what we've looked at here, we have looked at the evolution of liberation, originally a Third Reich political and then covert action, political warfare and covert action technique, into a mainstream American political force and a dominant influence in the 1952 Republican campaigns, both at the presidential and congressional levels. I would also note that the point man for the Republicans, Arthur Bliss Lane, was on the board of both the NCFE and the CFF, the two CIA organizations that were instrumental in projecting these Galen-related émigrés into American political life, where they served as the core and the catalyst for the generation of, quote, liberation or rollback theory into a major American political force. Also note that a CIA psychological warfare technique that was used in Italy and Eastern Europe was going to be used by Arthur Bliss Lane in the closing days of the 52 Republican campaign, but that Eisenhower's advisors nixed it. And also note that the main functionary for Arthur Bliss Lane in his Republican pro-liberation campaign, which, as Simpson notes, became indistinguishable in time from the CFF's program, the CIA program, was this fellow Vladimir Petrov, again a Third Reich collaborator, and he was the transportation and finance chief in the Nazi-occupied city of Krasnodar when thousands of people were being gassed in the so-called Gaswagen, the mobile gas chambers that were developed by Walter Rauff, an SS war criminal who also worked in conjunction with U.S. intelligence in Chile and other places. We've looked at that in past broadcasts. And again, at least in part, because of the pro-liberation campaign of Arthur Bliss Lane, the Republicans were elected, although they did not dominate these ethnic communities. They ultimately were able to greatly increase their electoral success, and they came to power with at least a rhetorical commitment to liberate Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Again, what we're going to look at now is yet another way in which these Gehlen and Third Reich-related elements came to play a significant role in American political life. And what we're going to be seeing here is the active collaboration between these Third Reich alumni, so to speak, and related elements, and the American radical right. And ultimately, the hookup between some of these same elements, these Third Reich residua, and the American radical right, produced the liberation milieu. What we're going to look at is their operation at the executive level, but the projection of these Gehlen-related elements into American political life as a result of the CFF campaign for generating pro-liberation sentiment in the United States, and again, that among other things, to generate American popular support for an enormous arms buildup. This led to the synthesis of domestic American reactionaries, national security elements, and Gehlen and Third Reich-related elements that we looked at in the explicitly fascist milieu, which was at the core of the assassination of President Kennedy, literally a fascist coup in the United States. And don't forget that George Herbert Walker Bush, as we looked at in the first installment of this archive show, is part and parcel to this milieu. Returning to Blowback by Christopher Simpson, we're going to take a look at now how former U.S. intelligence operative John Frenchy Grombach, again Grombach, put together an intelligence network of former SS officers and Third Reich collaborators, and how this organization originally worked on contract to the CIA, although it was never under any official Washington control. And then we're going to see how John Frenchy Grombach, who aspired to become CIA director, put this organization to work on behalf of Senator Joe McCarthy in McCarthy's attempts to purge Eisenhower appointees who didn't meet his standards. Simpson writes, during the late 1940s, Grombach had become a businessman who specialized in selling political and economic intelligence derived in large part from old boy networks of German SS officers, former Hungarian Axis Quislings, and Russian nationalist NTS men to the State Department, the CIA, and corporate customers in the United States and Western Europe. Grombach's espionage network operated through and was partially financed by the N.V. Philips Gloeilenampen Corporation of the Netherlands and its American affiliate Philips North America, according to reports found in his CIC dossier. That name's N.V. Philips, Gloeilampenfabrieken. Continuing. This was the same major electronics manufacturer that had provided a channel for his clandestine wartime operations. One of Grombach's most important assets, according to U.S. naval intelligence records obtained under the Freedom of Information Act, was SS General Karl Wolff, W-O-L-F-F, a major war criminal who had gone into the arms trade in Europe after the war. A second primary component of Grombach's private intelligence apparat was a large group of Hungarians loyal to the former royal privy councillor Tibor Eckhart, according to Ray Litalo, who handled liaison with Grombach's undercover service for State Department intelligence. Tibor Eckhart is T-I-B-O-R-E-C-K-H-A-R-D-T, Ray Litalo, Y-L-I-T-A-L-O. By the way, I would interject at this point that Karl Wolff was Himmler's personal adjutant. He was also the commander of all SS forces in Italy during the war, and the aforementioned Gero von Gewernitz, the fellow who helped work out the Christian West concept on behalf of the Third Reich and cooperating with Allen Dulles, was instrumental in helping to effect the surrender of the SS forces in Italy under Karl Wolff to the very same Allen Dulles. Of course, von Gewernitz then played a key role in convincing General Edwin Siebert of U.S. military intelligence to bring Gehlen on board. Karl Wolff, again, was a major war criminal, Himmler's personal adjutant. I would also note here, before we continue, that the Grombach organization, a private intelligence organization sponsored by corporate interests working on contract to the CIA and State Department, but never under their official control, represents a prototype for some of the same corporate-sponsored intelligence organizations which operated in conjunction with and parallel to the CIA and other intelligence agencies that we took a look at in the fascist milieu, the petroleum intelligence fascist milieu that we looked at in connection with the assassination of President Kennedy. Recall the Empire Trust Company, companies like DeGolyer and McNaughton, and some of the corporations which put together their own private CIAs and which worked in conjunction with the main CIA. And many of these operatives were involved with the assassination of John Kennedy, as we had seen. Continuing with Simpson's analysis of the Grombach organization, Grombach worked simultaneously under contract to the Department of State and the CIA. The ex-military intelligence man succeeded in creating, quote, one of the most unusual organizations in the history of the federal government, unquote, according to CIA Inspector General Lyman Kirkpatrick. Quote, it was developed completely outside of the normal governmental structure, but it used all of the normal cover and communications facilities normally operated by intelligence organizations, and yet never was under any control from Washington, unquote. Again, it was developed completely outside of the normal governmental structure, but it used all of the normal cover and communications facilities normally operated by intelligence organizations, and yet never was under any control from Washington. By the early 1950s, the U.S. government was bankrolling Grombach's underground activities at more than $1 million annually, Kirkpatrick has said. Continuing, we're going to see now how Grombach goes to work, puts his organization to work for Senator Joe McCarthy. Also, recall that as we looked at in Radio Free America program number 2, two of Joe McCarthy's main political backers were two German-American industrialists named Walter Harnischfeger and Frank Sensenbrenner, both of whom were very sympathetic to Hitler and active on behalf of Hitler prior to World War II, and that Joe McCarthy, among other things, conducted a brutal grilling of former American servicemen who had been involved with as victims or witnesses to the Malmedy massacre during the Battle of the Bulge, and basically accused them of being pro-communist or, quote, Jewish, unquote, and of maligning the Third Reich and driving Germany into the arms of the communists. Bear in mind that, again, Joe McCarthy himself, an individual with some pretty ripe political views, some of them actually overlapping directly with some of the Third Reich people that we've looked at in this particular archive show. Note also that many McCarthy-aligned elements, such as Robert Morris, were involved with the milieu that killed President Kennedy, not necessarily directly involved, but certainly involved with many of the elements and individuals who were instrumental in the assassination of President Kennedy. Continuing here with Simpson's account of Grombach's activities on behalf of Joe McCarthy. Through a quirk of fate, Frenchy Grombach found himself in a position where he could exercise enough influence in Washington to help derail the government careers of his rivals. U.S. government contracts bankrolling a network of former Nazis and collaborators gave him much of the ammunition he needed to do the job. Grombach has used his networks primarily to gather dirt. This was the American agent's specialty, his true passion: political dirt, sexual dirt, any kind of compromising information at all. Quote, he got into a lot of garbage pails, unquote, as Kirkpatrick puts it, and again quoting, and issued dirty linen reports on Americans. Grombach collected scandal, cataloged it, and used it carefully, just as he had done during the earlier McCormick investigation. By the way, that was the derailing of the OSS's RNA branch. Continuing, he leaked smears to his political allies in Congress and the press when it suited his purposes to do so. Grombach and congressional internal security investigators bartered these dossiers with one another almost as though they were boys trading baseball cards. One of Grombach's most important weapons in his struggle for power was a series of blackmail-type dossiers that his men had compiled on his rivals inside the U.S. intelligence community. He had retailed much of this data, piece by piece, to the CIA over the years, but by 1952 had decided to make use of his network of former SS men and collaborators on behalf of Senator Joseph McCarthy. Grombach's primary targets included a number of current and former U.S. intelligence officials: Charles Thayer, T-H-A-Y-E-R, Carmel Offie, O-F-F-I-E, William Bundy, Colonel Alfred McCormack, M-C-C-O-R-M-A-C-K, and a half-dozen others whom he regarded as vulnerable liberal targets. Grombach leaked these dirty linen files to Senator McCarthy, according to both Kirkpatrick and Latallo. Soon, an anonymous letter went the rounds on Capitol Hill, charging Thayer with sexual promiscuity, homosexuality, and a series of vague security violations during Thayer's tenure as Chief of the Voice of America, which was a frequent target of McCarthy's attacks. Other charges soon flowed out of McCarthy's offices about William Bundy, then a member of the CIA's elite Office of National Estimates, and John Peyton Davies, D-A-V-I-E-S, who had been George Kennan's right-hand man in Operation Bloodstone. That was one of the early Nazi utilization projects on behalf of U.S. intelligence. Continuing, skipping down, McCarthy let it be known that he intended to call Charles Thayer for hearings on his supposed fitness for office, perhaps at the same time that the nomination of Thayer's brother-in-law, Charles Bohlen, as ambassador to the USSR was up for consideration. Bohlen is B-O-H-L-E-N. The hearings, like most McCarthy events, would probably receive live national TV coverage. Thayer resigned a few days later. A simple resignation was not enough for McCarthy, however. The State Department had permitted Thayer to maintain the fiction that he had voluntarily resigned, quote, to pursue a writing career, unquote, and had even put out a press release to that effect. But McCarthy insisted on making Thayer's public humiliation complete. Under intense questioning by the senator, a department spokesman admitted that Thayer had been, quote, separated on the basis of morals charges, unquote, a 1950s euphemism for homosexuality. Newspapers headlined the case from coast to coast. That was one down. Next on McCarthy's list, and on Grombach's, was John Peyton Davies. Davies, a China policy specialist and close friend of George Kennan's, had frequently served as the policy planning staff's point man in Bloodstone cases. He had been instrumental in the immigrations of Nazi Foreign Office Specialist Hilger and the SS Wannsee Institute defector Papa in the exploitation of former Nazi agents Ulus and Sunch, and in much of the rest of the clandestine side of State Department affairs during the Truman administration. Names, by the way, Hilger again, H-I-L-G-E-R. Papa is P-O-P-P-E. Ulus is U-L-U-S, and Sunch is S-U-N-S-H. Continuing. Davies generally favored a hardline attitude toward Moscow, and even went so far as to advocate a, quote, preventive war against the USSR, unquote, as the New York Times described it, following the detonation of the first Soviet atomic bomb in 1949. In a more recent interview, however, Davies denied that he called for war with the Soviets, preferring instead to term his strategy a, quote, showdown, unquote. Ironically, though, Davies had become the whipping boy of the right-wing China lobby during the late 1940s because of his controversial opinions on American strategy in the Far East. He had once, in 1945, favored a de facto U.S. alliance with Mao Zedong in order to undermine Soviet influence in Asia. Davies' advice on this matter was largely rejected, but after Mao's victory in 1949, the far right in the United States scapegoated Davies and other State Department China hands as the supposed cause of Chiang Kai-shek's defeat. The sacrifice of John Peyton Davies at McCarthy's hands is a vivid illustration of the influence of the radical right on American political affairs. It's worth noting here before we continue that many of the people who were targets of McCarthy's ire here had actually been deeply involved in some of the Nazi utilization programs conducted by U.S. intelligence during the closing days of World War II, or during the post-World War II period. Continuing. Charles Bohlen, a close Kennan ally, who was, according to his own account, beginning again, Charles Bohlen, a close Kennan ally, who, according to his own account, had been instrumental in the original recruitment of German political warfare expert Hans Heinrich Herwarth for U.S. intelligence, was next. Eisenhower had nominated Bohlen as U.S. ambassador to the USSR in February of 1953, but the nomination had to be confirmed by the Senate before Bohlen could take his post. Ike liked and respected Chip Bohlen. They had been golf partners in France during the 40s. Eisenhower had personally chosen Bolin for the Moscow assignment, much to the discomfort of his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. Arthur Bliss Lane, Joe McCarthy, and the rest of the liberationist stalwarts balked at the Bolin nomination. Even Secretary of State Dulles was concerned about how Bolin's earlier leading role in containment and in the 1945 Yalta Accords with the USSR might look to voters who had just elected the Republicans on a liberation ticket. Skipping down again, and by the way, take note here that the main witness against Charles Bolin is a fellow named Igor Bogolepov, Bogolepov, and again, Bolin had brought Heinz Heinrich Herwarth, a major Third Reich political warfare specialist, into the U.S., but that wasn't good enough for McCarthy. And the main witness against Bolin in the congressional hearings, the senatorial confirmation process, was a fellow named Igor Bogolepov, who was an NTS man, again, the National Toilers Alliance of the Solidarists, elements of which worked for the Third Reich, then U.S. intelligence, and elements of which, as we have seen, were involved in the assassination of John Kennedy. Continuing. McCarthy presented his trump card at the climax of his argument. It was an affidavit from Igor Bogolepov, who claimed that he knew that the Soviet secret police had regarded Bolin as a, quote, possible source of information, unquote, and a, quote, friendly diplomat, unquote, during a Bolin tour of duty in Moscow in the 1930s. Bogolepov was an NTS man who freelanced as an anti-communist expert in Washington. In the early 1950s, he was on a number of payrolls, including Grombach's and the State Department's. Litalo says that it was Grombach who primed Bogolepov for his role in McCarthy's attack on Bolin. Bogolepov had once been a Soviet foreign ministry official, but he defected to the Nazis and spent most of World War II making anti-Semitic propaganda broadcasts for the Goebbels ministry. Bogolepov says that U.S. intelligence brought him to this country in the late 1940s, apparently illegally considering his work for Goebbels, and that he had worked on and off for the CIA for several years. In time, however, Bogolepov grew discontented with the agency, mainly because it did not pay him as much as he thought he deserved. The cooler heads on Capitol Hill considered Bogolepov a crackpot. The radical right, however, did not, and readily used his statements as, quote, proof, unquote, that, among other things, communist fellow travelers were engaged in a campaign to rewrite U.S. Army training manuals, and that Charles Bolin was, quote, possibly, unquote, an undercover Stalinist agent. Even Bogolepov's affidavit failed to bail out McCarthy this time. The senator was outvoted, and Bolin's nomination was approved. The New York Times carried the entire affair on its front page and prominently quoted the NTS man's affidavit. The Russian defector's stint in the Goebbels ministry, which had been made public in earlier congressional testimony, was not mentioned in the report. McCarthy succeeded in drawing some blood, despite losing the vote on Bolin. According to columnists Joseph and Stuart Alsop, Republican Majority Leader Robert Taft visited Eisenhower shortly after the vote. Taft insisted that, quote, no more Bolins, unquote, be sent to the Senate as nominees. Eisenhower agreed, the Alsops reported, and Taft, quote, hastened to spread the happy word on Capitol Hill that Senator McCarthy and his ilk would thereafter enjoy a virtual veto on all presidential appointments, unquote. The Alsops were overstating the case, perhaps, but it was clear enough that McCarthy had demonstrated his power as a spoiler in the Senate. Eisenhower's diplomatic nominations were screened for their acceptability to the extreme right for much of the rest of his administration. So again, even though Charles Bolin was not deep-sixed as a result of the activities of Messrs. McCarthy and Grombach and Bogolepov, and again, note that Bogolepov had originally worked for Goebbels' propaganda ministry, later the CIA, and finally freelanced on behalf of Grombach and McCarthy. This did have a significant effect on Eisenhower's appointments policies. However, one of the most important things to note, and I'm going to wrap this installment of the broadcast up with this last section of blowback, is that even though the Eisenhower administration was elected in considerable measure as a result of the pro-liberation campaign that was conducted by Arthur Bliss Lane, working at the same time for NCFE and for CFF, and even though his appointments were affected by the combined activities of Grombach's Third Reich emigre and in conjunction with Joe McCarthy's attacks, the Eisenhower administration basically remained committed to the containment versus the rollback philosophy. What we're going to look at next week is how the fascist milieu involving an intersection of the national security establishment, the American radical right, and these Third Reich emigre, George Bush being part of that axis, this explicitly fascist milieu. We're going to take a look at how they were dissatisfied with the Eisenhower administration next week, and how political warfare and psychological warfare ultimately was transformed or replaced by the use of covert action and deadly force, that with the assassination of John Kennedy, but that will be next week. Even though, again, despite the activities of Messrs. McCarthy and Grombach and Bogolopov, despite the synthesis of the liberation campaign and the liberation philosophy introduced into the United States as a result of CIA domestic activity, chiefly CFF, bear in mind originally this was a Third Reich political warfare strategy and covert action strategy introduced into the U.S. by these Gehlen-related elements and through CIA activity. The Eisenhower administration remained committed to containment rather than rollback philosophy, and ultimately, as we'll look at next week, Eisenhower began to seek détente with the Soviet Union. That did not sit well with the milieu, which assumed power on 11/22/63. Of Eisenhower's ultimate commitment to containment rather than liberation or rollback theory, Simpson writes as follows: "But despite the Republicans' public attacks on Truman's containment policy, Eisenhower's election had been a victory for the Republican establishment, not for the radical right. The Republicans did not have a substantially new strategy for dealing with the Soviets beyond a tendency to use harsher rhetoric than the Democrats. George Kennan's containment theories may have seemed like part of the problem to most liberation advocates, but his thinking on clandestine political warfare against the Soviets was most welcome to Eisenhower and dominated the scene at the Solarium strategy conferences. Eisenhower himself personally endorsed Kennan's stratagems, his analysis of East-West affairs, and the former diplomat himself. The President and his advisors decisively renewed the ongoing program of harassment and destabilization inside Eastern Europe that had given birth to the Nazi utilization efforts in the first place." And again, next week, we will begin looking at dissatisfaction on behalf of the rollback or liberation milieu, the milieu that ascended on November 22nd, 1963, and we're going to take a look at how ultimately the dissatisfaction, first with Eisenhower, and then their complete revulsion with Kennedy, led to a fascist coup, literally the overthrow of the legitimate constitutional authority in the United States, the assassination of John Kennedy, and in succeeding installments we will see how the liberation milieu evolved into the Reagan administration and the current state of affairs both in the United States and in the rest of the world. This concludes this installment of Radio Free America program number 37, How the United States Lost the Second World War.